British Republic scum! Your puny torpedoes are no match for my thermo shields!
What's up, MetaNerds? This will be a complete breakdown of the Providence-class dreadnought, one of the most important ships in the CIS Navy. We'll look at everything from firepower, complement, capacity, and how it shaped the Clone Wars. Specific ships like the Invincible, Lucid Voice, and Invisible Hand, and even how the scraps of these ships would come to haunt the Imperial era, an attempt to destroy Tarkin's rise to power. This capital ship was both designed and constructed by the Quarren of the Free DAC Volunteers Engineering Corps, with collaboration in some parts coming from Rendili Star Drive. The Quarren shared their home-world DAC with the Mon Calamari, and like the old phrase says, coral sharpens coral, or something like that. And just as the Mon Calamari were famed for being the best engineers in the galaxy for most of history, so much so that their prowess would end up providing the Rebel Alliance with a powerful edge, their rivalry drove the Quarren to be excellent shipwrights also. At the time of the Clone Wars, the tension between these two species came to a head. Mon Calamari had always seen themselves as the more wise and peaceful of the two, and the galaxy seemed to agree, with almost all political power and wealth ending up in the hands of the fish folk, not the Squidbillies. So it's a small-scale example of what happened to the galaxy as a whole, with the secession of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and Dooku knew that the Quarren would make for a natural ally. This secession occurred about 2 years before the war officially broke out, and while the founding of the Free DAC Volunteer Engineering Corps is stated at 22 BBY, we can assume that construction of these massive warships began at a time when it was still illegal under Republic law. Mon Calamari shipyards could pump out a Star Cruiser in 6 months, and the Empire at its peak was claiming anywhere from 3 months to 2 years to build an Imperial Star Destroyer. So let's say around a year for a Providence, likely constructed in those years leading up to the Battle of Geonosis. The Quarren shipyard was located on the planet Pamant, which already had a several millennia-old colony of anti-Calamarians, and these Pamant docks would be a main shipyard for the Confederacy, producing almost all of the capital ships, including the experimental Malevolence. The Providence cost 125 million credits, while it seems that the larger version that is twice its size, like the Invincible, cost 400,585,000 credits, which is more than twice the Imperial Star Destroyer. Powered by 3 Crevealed 4 radial ion engines, which were made by Nubia Star Drives, the producer of most of Naboo's ships. These top-of-the-line engines reached a max acceleration of 2,500 G and 70 megalight per hour, with a top atmospheric speed of 2,000 kilometers per hour, which made it faster than almost all starfighters, and would leave other capital ships in the dust, while being more than twice the Venator, which was known for its speed. And though the Venator was quicker in hyperspace, the Class 1.5 hyperdrive puts the Providence right in between the Venator and ISD. To achieve this, the entire aft section was filled with primary and auxiliary reactors, while there were also subsidiary reactors and hyperdrive fuel silos located towards the bow, right below the command bridge, which provided a 180-degree view of the battlefront, and was packed with the best sensor and navigational equipment credits could buy, as well as a suite of dedicated computers to track everything going on inside of the Providence, track the starfighters connected on the surface of it, and of course how they were deployed out in space. With scanners that could reach out to search through entire solar systems and send out encrypted messages through hyper relays all across the galaxy in an instant, with incredibly complex arrays filling up this spire, an area that was connected by 5 turbolifts, with the uppermost part of the spire containing the private quarters of the warship's commanding officer. On Dooku's Providence, they nicknamed it the Wizard's Tower, as he would set it up like a meditation chamber. And just like how Sidious could choke out people via holo, Dooku would try to radiate his will into populations through a unique form of propaganda that combined force suggestion and high-tech broadcast equipment. In the Old Republic times, there was the practice of battle meditations, where powerful force users could increase the will of their fighters.
Bastila is no longer using her battle meditation against us. The tide has turned.
So it's interesting to wonder if the Providence was ever used for this purpose during the Clone Wars. Like the rounded shapes of the Mon Cala craft, the Quarrens used a streamlined modular design to construct the Providence, with a large cylinder at the center, and then more tubes to circle around that one, cutting away where they connect to create a really powerful and aerodynamic design. A unique geometry that dispersed the weight better than most competitors. And just because they spent a lot of time in space, all warships were still designed to travel through diverse planetary atmospheres as well, with emergency deceleration panels that can be used to rapidly slow down, so that if you wanted to, you could take full advantage of its speed and slam the brakes with a combo of reversing the thrusters. And this isn't explicitly stated anywhere, but most ships could also go underwater, especially the Mon Calamari design, and so it's reasonable to think that's true for the Quarren designs as well. This hull is also covered in hundreds of smaller sensors and comms that work to communicate with the droid starfighters that could connect to just about anywhere on the outside of the ship for quicker deployment, or if the mission required them to pack on short term while you really filled up that hangar.
General Grievous' ship is directly ahead.
The one crawling with Vulture droids.
But besides that, the standard complement was 120 Vultures, 120 Tri-Fighters, 10 Hyena bombers, usually all lining the hangar and connected to overhead racks, while right underneath this section is where the 160 MTTs, and roughly 280 vehicles in any combo of AATs, Hailfire droids, OG-9 Spider droids, and M9 432 Crab droids. With all these land vehicles usually packing into a C-9979 landing craft that transferred down to a planet's surface like with the Lucrehulks. The 900 crew members included organic officers, but was mostly droids, while it could transport 48,247 passengers, which is how these things were used for a great PR role when they evacuated whole settlements from the lawless pirates or corrupt Republic forces. And along with them, they had 1.5 million deactivated, stored battle droids packed in as well, with a 18,000 metric ton cargo capacity, which was used to move war materiel or relief aid for CIS worlds. The weapon systems and shielding were powerful enough to match, designed to be so strong that a single Providence could maintain a planetary blockade through expert use of the starfighter complement, speed, and firepower. Many of these guns were charged at a higher rate, and the number of guns in each battery were designed to pierce through the deflector shields of most ships out there. With its 14 port and starboard heavy quad turbolaser cannons, 34 dorsal and ventral turret mounted dual heavy laser cannons, 12 port and starboard twin light point defense ion cannons, and 2 forward-mounted battleship heavy ion cannons, as well as 102 proton torpedo launchers, with each carrying 3 torpedoes. And then you had 12 heavy flak guns and 10 heavy tractor beam emitters placed along its port and starboard side, which all makes for a brilliant and great purpose-built dreadnought. Remember, it is incredibly fast, and its speed would be shocking to even the most veteran pilots out there, something that forced the Republic to play catch-up early on in the war. All these heavy-rated weaponry are for punching through capital ships while leaving the anti-starfighter role to the point defense cannons, using less energy since they are just ion cannons, and so they could leave an enemy starfighter or vessel dead in space, letting the Vultures or Hyenas blow them to bits, allowing for the Providence to focus on the main enemy craft. The 2 heavy ion cannons are forward-facing, for a full steam-ahead attack that would short out the enemy shield generators and unleash its proton torpedoes, with that large forward beak-like rostrum for ramming into a ship if the need arose. If the enemy was to the side, the heavy cannons could overwhelm the shields, and let the port or starboard tractor beams keep the target in place for a barrage of torpedoes and then let the droid fighters swarm and envelop them. While on defense, this enormous credit investment was protected by a state-of-the-art thermal shielding, which was able to handle long barrages of even heavy turbolaser fire. Now there were some variants like the Providence carrier, which enlarged this hangar, likely stripping away the passenger and maybe even the B-1 droid troop sections, as well as the simply named larger model, which is almost exactly double the size of the standard version. At 2,177.35 meters long, or 1.35 miles, it was nearly twice the Venator, longer than an ISD, but still half that of a subjugator. Having a supersized version of the same ship might seem odd, but they did the same thing with the Recusant too. And the standard size Providence was actually shorter than the standard Recusant, despite being more powerful, while being less than half as wide as a Venator and about 1.5 times taller, though that height is mostly in these spires. And if it showed up here on Earth, it would be between the height of the Eiffel Tower and Empire State Building. You'll see as we look through its history that it is often the command ship of large CIS fleets, being the home base using its vast array of sensors and protective cloud of fire to act like a fortress, a wall other CIS vessels could retreat behind if need be, and from which the commander would coordinate the entire mission. Though none of the major CIS capital ships would be present during the Battle of Geonosis, or more accurately the evacuation of Geonosis by CIS leadership, days later General Worm Loathsome would head the siege of Christophsis, in the CIS's hopes to cut off the Republic access to the Corellian Run, sending a fleet that included 23 Munificents, 6 Lucrehulks, and a Providence to coordinate them all. While the General would lead the fight planet side, this particular Providence was the Invincible, the flagship of the infamous Admiral Trench. Republic Admiral Yularen recognized the Arch Admiral from before the war, at a time when Trench was the commander of corporate fleets. His command of this supersized Providence is evidence that he was the best admiral in the CIS. Anakin would attempt a rescue mission to Christophsis, and Trench showed why his style paired so well with this powerful dreadnought.
The command ship is bearing down on us!
Though the command ship, he sees that he can crush this smaller fleet of 3 Venators and 3 Pelta-class medical frigates. It's obvious that they are attempting a blockade run, not trying to clear out the entire blockade, and so he uses this ship's speed to close the gap in hopes of forcing them to retreat. The sheer firepower of the Venator demanded respect, so it isn't that Trench thinks this trio can't do anything to him, but by being so aggressive with this larger variant, he can make the Republic Admiral realize that there was no hope at just blowing through a gap in the blockade. Best case, they would lose most of their ships just engaging this single Providence. When Kenobi arrives with his Venator, the Negotiator, he assures his Padawan that they had a secret weapon, and they need to retreat for now. Frustrated, Skywalker does comply, and Republic forces retreat behind the moon. T-Series droid TI-99 recommended they pursue, but Trench disagrees.
They are escaping. Should we go after them? No! Our orders are to blockade, not chase. I have won this round. Recycle the shields and let the cannons reset to a full charge.
He knows the biggest advantage is the thermal shielding, and the power of those heavy cannons and torpedoes. The prototype stealth ship would emerge from behind the moon and pass right by the Munificence on its approach to Christophsis, while Trench was ordering the bombers to be launched to finish off Bail Organa's Republic forces. This worked to pressure Kenobi to rush to Bail's defense and engage, which leads both Skywalker and Yularen to agree that Kenobi was wrong here, that Trench was baiting him, and though Skywalker is the only one crazy enough to think to use the stealth prototype against this supersized dreadnought.
Sir?
You heard me, Admiral.
What are you doing?
And even Trench is surprised.
This is unusual. What can they be planning?
Minutes later, he can tell something is off, and spots the ship the second it decloaks.
There! A cloaked ship!
The Republic knew to target the command bridge right up front, but the shielding did its job.
Your puny torpedoes are no match for my thermo shields.
While the cannon fire tries to hit them, and Trench can tell by this expert piloting that his enemy is a Jedi pilot, not a clone. The ship was able to go stealth again, and Trench knows he just has to wait, while also launching some psychological weapons.
You have an impressive new vessel, but I warn you, I have dealt with its kind before.
Whether it is personal cloaks or these cloak shipping technologies, there have been a long history of their use, but they were never that widespread. Trench's experience defending corporate space was invaluable, seeing all sorts of odd tactics and technologies from various star systems, and he's likely the only person on either side to have had history taking out cloaked ships.
Maybe he's tracking the magnetic signature.
The only way to test this theory was to let the missiles get a lock on them, and when the clone engineers confirmed that it was via magnetic signature, as the stealth ship turns towards them, the smaller craft was not as easy to hit with the heavy turbolasers, and was so fast that within seconds it was barreling towards the bridge, and Trench knew his only hope was with the shielding.
Raise the shields!
We cannot. The shields are still recharging.
Made to slug it out in capital ship battles, the enemy ship wasn't supposed to be able to close the gap in between shield generation, something that proved fatal when faced against the brazen tactics of a smaller, faster craft. And once the Invincible was out of the fight, the blockade quickly became disorganized and the Republic was able to protect their allies on world. A year later, the CIS was going on a war crime spree, using smaller fleets anchored by a Providence to conduct hit-and-run attacks on Republic medical space stations throughout the galaxy. It might seem like an odd role for the powerful dreadnought, but morality aside, it was a creative use of its overwhelming power and speed, popping out of hyperspace, blasting right through whatever shielding it had, without much concern for smaller defense forces, and then slipping away through the blue void. Grievous would lead the assault on Kamino, but not from the invisible hand, though this unnamed Providence would take up the intended role as a command ship for the overall fleet, serving the same role during the Battle of Sullust, where Sidious ordered Dooku to execute his assassin. The CIS ships focused their fire on this Providence in an attempt to kill her. They're again seen using their overwhelming power to capture Even Peel, and later used to capture Adigalia by boarding her Venator, before blowing it apart with this same trio of ships tactic that we saw with the hit and runs on medical stations. This isn't confirmed, but perhaps smaller Providence-led fleets were launched to blitz any Republic assets caught lacking a sufficient fleet. Intel Sidious often linked to Dooku, so these ship trios were acting like special forces, assassin/kidnapping squads. When the Umbaran seceded and threw in with the CIS, an enormous fleet was rapidly deployed here to establish a blockade, which, though not perfect, the blockade greatly restricted the forces that were able to make it on-world, causing the Battle of Umbara to be one of the bloodiest for the Republic, with officers on the Providence coordinating the dozens of support craft that filled the skies. And though in the Battle of Dathomir we don't really see much of the orbital support, Dooku and Grievous weren't playing around when it came to ending the Night Sisters, sending a fleet with 4 Munificents, 2 Recusants, 2 supply ships, and a Providence, all to end a tribe of witches with no navy. When the CIS developed an encryption module that allowed them to crack Republic transmission codes, they placed it inside a powerful dreadnought with a full fleet of support. connecting the module to an excellent suite of sensors and hyperwave transmitters to try and track Republic movement all across the galaxy. The super tactical droid Otto was the commander of this fleet and had his prize tech stolen when D Squad infiltrated the Providence. By 20 BBY, Grievous's well-honed blitz method got him the greatest win yet, destroying the flagship of his archenemy Kenobi when they swarmed his ship and forced the Jedi to set it to blow after being overwhelmed. A year later, we see 5 of them in defense of Ringovinda, and Dooku would arrive in his personal fleet to force Clovis's hand in a move that would end up pressuring the Republic to take control of the banks. When Skywalker's fleet arrives, Dooku fled and what could have been an epic but deadly space battle was avoided. In the final months of the war, it would act as the command ship for Grievous's assault on Maul's Shadow Collective, and then Trench's final battle over Anaxis. The Republic shipyards here were some of the most important in the galaxy, and after escaping death over Christophsis and surviving the Battle of Ringovinda, his new flagship, the Invulnerable, was leading the assault with 2 other Providence dreadnoughts, 7 Munificents, 2 Recusants, and 6 Omni support vessels. This assault would last for weeks, with Trench's secret weapon being the strategy algorithm designed by Rex and extracted by Echo. The clone who was thought long dead, but had been reduced to a husk, a biological computer hooked up to a CIS system that would mine his mind for valuable Republic intel. When Echo was recovered, and Skywalker with Clone Force 99 were able to sneak onto the flagship, Trench was finally killed, and the Jedi used the Providence class's self-destruct feature to turn its sheer size and reactors against the fleet, igniting a chain reaction as debris from the Invulnerable barraged all the allies in its path. In what would prove to be the final days of the war, space battles were increasing along major hyper routes, and reinforcements were sent to crush Plo Koon in the 442nd Siege Battalion's push to liberate Cato Neimoidia, which was followed by the single largest battle of the war, when over 1,000 CIS craft, led by Grievous upon the Invisible Hand, took this blitz tactic to another level. Just like how it worked to take out med stations and kidnap Jedi generals, scaled up, the principles were the same. The relatively untested Coruscant home defense fleet was quickly rendered useless, as Grievous barreled through the orbital defenses, down into the atmosphere, and captured the Supreme Chancellor. Getting him back into the Invisible Hand, the supposedly most powerful man in the galaxy was now in restraints, at the mercy of Grievous and Dooku. Just as Sidious planned, the Republic's Open Circle fleet, along with Kenobi and the Chosen One, would arrive just in time to cut off the CIS escape. After navigating through clouds of droid fighters, they were able to deactivate the deflector shields that protected the hangar, and make their way through the ship. Dooku didn't realize that his beheading was also right in line with the plan, but the broadside volley from the Venator Gwalara shook things up, blasting through the massive dreadnought and setting off proton bombs to create a chain reaction that caused the repulsor fields and power systems to fail, sending the ship into a nosedive as it was no longer countering the gravitational effects of Coruscant, and you can see a glimmer of the shielding struggling to keep up. As it plummeted, loose ships and massive MTTs were launched across the hangar, but reversing the stabilizers and Grievous's quick call,
Fire the emergency booster engines!
did help to level out the ship, and he used the in-ship security features like ray shields and droidicas to help capture these Republic VIPs. While the fight in the command bridge resulted in Grievous's escape through the window, forcing an emergency viewport wall to engage to seal the room, and the cyborg would get away by launching all of the escape pods at once, in order to minimize his odds of being shot down or captured. But as the Invisible Hand kept barreling through the atmosphere, more systems were failing, and the entire aft section rips away, leaving only that original central tube that the rest of the Providence tubes are built around. This main section is expertly set down by the galaxy's best pilot for what only could be described as
another happy landing.
While Coruscant celebrated the heroic rescue of their beloved leader, roughly 250,000 people were killed by the falling debris of the Invisible Hand, mostly this main back section, which could have easily taken out several skyscrapers. And symbolic of the charade of war, once the dust cleared, the Emperor was on his throne, and Republic and CIS craft all went to the same grave, on the junkyard world of Braca. Enormous efforts went into dismantling all sorts of ships, and this is a breeding ground for corruption and black market opportunities. The Invincible and Lucid Voice ended up here, and with some clever and covert movements, Birch Teller's rebel group were able to Frankenstein themselves a smaller but still powerful version of a Providence. This was long before the unified Rebel Alliance, and this group was light years ahead of other resistance fighters who were using an odd laser cannon or have a good slicer in their midst. This Teller Providence was 920 meters long and had 12 turbolasers, 10 point defense ion cannons, and 6 proton torpedo launchers. Perhaps even if they could have stolen more than this, they likely wanted to keep it as streamlined as possible, so that they actually had enough fuel and munitions to use it. Pure efficiency, it must have been the most powerful Rebel craft sailing the stars at this time, 14 BBY. Throw in that the Empire wasn't expecting anything like this, and you can see why they were able to get away with Grievous's old strategy for some time, before it came to the attention of Tarkin. Because outside of that firepower, their comms and sensor jamming suites were still functional, and used to cut off communications for backup, stop the spread of propaganda, and slice into hollow-wave transmitters to broadcast the true events of Imperial war crimes, stuff the news would never cover. While other times their armament was used to just blow up the hyperwave transmitters, there must have been countless rebels that would have been indirectly saved by these efforts, without even knowing who Birchteller was or what his gang was up to, just thanking the force that stormtrooper backup never showed, or some TIE fighter patrol peeled off to deal with this mysterious communications failure. But with the attack on Sentinel Base, the secret Death Star construction facility that Tarkin was in charge of, he would get to figuring out who this enemy was, and knew that some of the IDs from the Clone Wars era must have still been in these Frankenstein parts.
Analysis of data received by the Command Center's friend or foe indicator confirms that the capital ship is a downsized version of a Separatist Providence-class cruiser carrier, modified with modules taken from CIS frigates and destroyers, which the Seps, usually mounted aft rather than forward, appear to have come from the cruiser Lucid Voice.
And as you might expect, Tarkin made sure that they would pay, and this respectable foe was added to Tarkin's long list of vanquished enemies, with the ship being destroyed in 14 BBY at the Gulf of Tatooine. Though there was at least one more Providence, this being the dedicated carrier variant that came into the naval forces of the Alliance to restore the Republic, the now unified Rebel force, and it was painted with their bold red color. So that's it for the breakdown. As for behind the scenes facts, this original cross-section is actually a source of a lot of canon material, like having the first mention of the Lucid Voice, as well as a ton of other details on how the ship works. The design was inspired by Zeppelins, and this sound was meant to reference the unique Zeppelin sound. Some depictions in video games put the bridge all over the place, from being in the center to the top of the spire, and this is one of the few ships or vehicles that had their stats dramatically changed from Legends to canon, almost double the speed, but my points earlier about it being surprisingly fast still stand, and even in Legends it was still faster than the Venator. And if you want to look into it more, a lot of these details come from these books. But most important of all, remember, the Force has a love of irony, so make sure your ship has a humble name, and the Force will be with you, always.
Get me a tractor beam lock on Kenobi's ship and prepare a boarding party.
What's up, MetaNerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the Recusant class light destroyer. We will cover its history before, during, and after the Clone Wars, examine the larger variant that was more than twice its size, do a tour of the interior and exterior, and understand its armament, complement, role within a CIS fleet, and even end on some behind the scenes facts. If you learn anything new, please hit that like button, as it really helps to promote the video in the algorithm, and shows me you want to see more videos like this. And comment your thoughts on the Recusant, as well as what you'd like to see in future videos. But with that, let's head to the Outer Rim world of Dak, to see where this thing was first constructed. To most in the galaxy, this watery world was known as Mon Cala, named after its more popular species, the Mon Calamari. But Dak was the name the natives called this world, a place that was home to a rival high-tech people, the Quarren. These two species had been at war for most of their history, with the Calamari usually winning and lording over their more aggressive neighbors. But around 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the planetary government was able to keep the peace long enough to focus their efforts on constructing enormous shipyards in orbit above Dak. Together, these two once enemies could create high-tech works of art. Incredible spacecraft that allowed them to colonize the worlds and moons in their solar system. Despite the shared effort by the Quarrens at every level from welder to engineer, space freighter to planet homesteading, the shipyard that would come to be renowned throughout the entire galaxy was called the Mon Calamari Shipyards. Even just calling it the Dak Shipyards would have gone a long way to show unity. And over the next 1,000 years, the tensions between these two species never died down. And when the entire galaxy was fracturing in the mid-20s BBY, the Quarren were finding their interests more aligned with those pushing for secession from the Republic. The Mon Calamari declared that their world would remain loyal, and this separation along species lines resulted in the latest of countless civil wars between these people. Count Dooku made sure that these Quarren would be taken care of, and many of the species would flee their homeworld and establish the Free Dak Volunteers Engineering Corps on a Commerce Guild-controlled waterworld of Mintuine. But before they fled, they made sure to take some designs for potential warships. The future leaders of the CIS would work together with these Quarren to ensure that they had everything they needed to build vessels for the coming war. connecting them with the Techno-Union and Horish Kessel Drive in order to produce the Recusant-class light destroyers. I should note that just because it was designed by the Mon Calamari shipyards, does not mean for sure that this was a Quarren stealing a Calamari design. It may have been drawn up by the squiddy hands of a Quarren who felt that his people were being ignored or oppressed by the centralized leaders. And if that was true, it would make the backstory of this ship a sort of metaphor for the Clone Wars. This destroyer was built around cutting-edge automated droid brain technology, which is what gave it its skeletal appearance, as many systems and sections for crews were not needed, allowing it to operate with only 300 crew, which themselves could be droids, while it could store an additional 40,000 battle droids. There were still several habitable decks located in this main area, but the majority of this ship is dedicated to the cargo, which would store the droids, weapons, and supplies for the CIS. This main section would contain the reactor that was claimed to annihilate 8,600 tons of fuel per second when traveling at its max speed and firing all of its weapons. The armored shaft that connects the main body to the engine array would contain a series of power and fuel lines, energizing these 3 sublight engines which could get the Recusant up to a mass acceleration of 2800 G, something that was 300 G faster than the Providence, but 200 slower than the Venator, something Grievous and his T-Series tactical droid were well aware of.
The enemy ships are faster and more maneuverable. I suggest caution.
Its hyperdrive was rated as a Class 2 with a backup Class 12, putting it in the range of most capital ships. But like most things, it was slower than the remarkably quick Venator, and it had a max range of 30,000 light-years, which is half the Venator and about 1/8 the Acclamator. Like almost all spacecraft, it is equipped with an energy shield, and the armor is rated at 430 RU, which puts it in the range of the Nebulon B. One of the most unique features were these double-layered armor plates. Even if it was hit by armored penetrating missiles or heavy turbolaser fire, that would smash through this and into the second layer, an excellent way to block shrapnel from blasting through the decks. Though it does beg the question why this idea wasn't used around this weak junction between the engine array and the main body. It seems like you could have just easily made a series of tubes over the sections to have the same effect, but over an even more crucial area. As for the armament, the official numbers available do seem to be describing the larger variant, and so with that we'll start by looking under the bridge to find a massive heavy turbolaser cannon. There are 5 more of these heavies in the forward fixed or rear fixed position, along with 6 more that are on turrets, and then an insane amount of anti-starfighter weaponry in the form of point defense laser cannons. You can see some running along the vulnerable spine of the ship, which was its way of protecting against bombers going after this weak spot. But in total, all over the ship, there were 30 dual laser cannons, 12 dual light, and 60 single light point defense laser cannons. As for its complement, the Recusant, Munificent, and Providence all took advantage of the fact that their forces were made up of droid starfighters. Less of a need for a formal hangar bay when your pilot is built in, and is perfectly fine with being exposed to space indefinitely, magnetically attaching to any available surface, ready to swarm anyone that gets too close to the hive. But this design went even further to leave these empty spaces behind that armor plating, making a Durasteel grid that kept the area strong, but also left a lot of space for Vultures and Hyenas to attach and keep themselves out of incoming fire. Visiting ships would have to use the multiple docking tubes on the port and starboard sides, but the larger variant did have a decent sized pair of hangar bays added, and Grievous decided to get even more creative by having a C-9979 landing craft attached to the underside. They are not officially listed, but at least the larger variant did possess a tractor beam array that was powerful enough to bully an Arquitans, and even at least a heavily damaged Venator. Using this, Grievous' strategy would be to pull the enemy vessel toward one of the docking tubes, with the Republic vessel in a tractor lock.
Give me a tractor beam lock on Kenobi's ship and prepare a boarding party.
While many of the Recusant's own cannons could still fire on the ship that it was docked with, which was great against the Republic, but also for destroying ships of anyone that was summoned to meet with Grievous, just in case negotiations didn't go as planned. Because while many worlds freely chose to secede, Dooku and Grievous were not against using this tactic to encourage world leaders to join the Confederacy. Also, since it was almost always paired up with multiple Munificent-class frigates, they could scramble around dealing out their heavy firepower and pushing enemies towards the Recusant's heavy turbolasers, and/or herd them closer to that powerful tractor beam's effective range. All of this was controlled by the bridge that would be commanded by a T-Series droid, with specific ship tasks being controlled by standard B1s. Interestingly, not the OOM pilot droids that we see with the Providence and Lucrehulk. something that may be a hint at the power of this droid brain that this entire ship was designed around. An automated AI system that these other droids could easily interface with, and which the Separatists felt fine entrusting with the T-Series. Though the larger variants do seem like they always have an organic commander as well. The entire bridge is covered in these large transparent steel windows, a design which allows for an incredible visual of the battlefront, perhaps better than almost any other capital ship of this era. Another interesting detail is that this video comm system in the ship has a rare style that we see in the Lucrehulk, meaning that this must be a Horish Kessel Drive feature as they helped to build this vessel and were the sole shipwright of the Lucrehulk. Moving to the dorsal side, we see this forest of antenna that allowed this to communicate with a seemingly endless swarm of droids, as well as tracking enemy communications and securing their own transmissions while sending and receiving from CIS assets located across the galaxy. This sloping, rounded off angle of the armor plating was designed to help better circulate the energy shields. And the ship could also store 10,000 tons of cargo, a weight equal to more than 12,000 dewbacks, while having enough supplies that it could last out on a mission for up to 2 years at a time. And here is one of the few times where we can see the smaller variant next to the larger one we saw used by Grievous. This standard one is 1,187 meters, or 0.74 miles long, making it about 4 ARC-170s longer than a Venator. It had a width of 157 meters, or about 515 feet, making it about 1/3 as wide as the Republic's cruiser. And it had a height of 163 meters, or 535 feet, making it about 61% as tall as the Venator, or about 8 sandcrawlers stacked on top of each other. While the larger variant was 2,544 meters, or 1.58 miles long, making it about more than twice the length of the Venator, or 1.5 times an Imperial Star Destroyer. If they showed up here on Earth, the standard version would be about 4.5 times that of the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, or about 1.4 times the height of the Burj Khalifa, while the larger variant would be about half as wide as Manhattan, or about 3 times the largest cruise ship, the Symphony of the Seas. After this destroyer started coming off the assembly lines on Mintuine, one of the things they noticed was a critical failure of that droid brain that streamlined most of the ship's processes. There were numerous collisions within the CIS fleet in these early weeks of the war, causing a panicked rush to update this AI system. It is unclear if the Republic was ever aware of this issue, and throughout the remainder of the war we wouldn't really see it, with one exception I'll get to in a second. Even after this update, one of the quirks that remained with the AI was their bloodlust. All of the Recusant's AIs would continue to fight against a target without giving up until it or themselves were destroyed. And luckily for the CIS tacticians, the T-Series or organic commanders would be able to override this default reaction. Throughout the war, we would see the larger variant in the cyborg hands of Grievous, using it over Seleucami and Camino. Many were protecting the CIS capital world of Raxus, and one shows us that it had enough firepower to take out the larger Providence class during the betrayal of Ventress. And many would be seen during the epic final moments of the Clone Wars during the Battle of Coruscant, where we do see that old AI bug kicking in, with some Recusants crashing into Munificents. But when you consider the fact that this whole war was created by and played on both sides by Darth Sidious, it is interesting to wonder if this was a bug or a feature. An Order 66, if you will, that could be switched on even with ships. Later this same year, in 19 BBY, a group of Jedi were able to commandeer a Recusant and flee Kashyyyk. Most of these vessels were destroyed by the Empire, but a few were repurposed into their navy or sold off to the Corporate Sector Authority, one of the few areas of the galaxy that was powerful enough to retain its independence during the Imperial era. Though with this process, at least one fell into the hands of the Rebellion, being seen in a major rebel fleet in the year 0 ABY. Though it did have to be extensively modified to allow for a larger organic crew that was now calling this Separatist ship home. The legacy of the Recusant would fade over the following decades, but we see it one last time in the year 137 ABY, where it was used to make up the secret Jedi retreat on the planet Tyvos, the hidden temple of the Jedi during the Sith Imperial War. So that's it for its breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Some of the lore is definitely trying to make it seem like these were Commerce Guild ships that were always used for trade and that were repurposed for the war effort, with the ships being donated from all sorts of allies across countless worlds. But then other lore establishes that the Quarren took the plans from the Mon Calamari shipyards, and that it was always purpose designed for a warship to carry droid forces. I really like that original idea of them being repurposed commerce ships, and the only way I can think to smooth over these contradictions in the lore is to play with the timeline a bit, because it is true that the Republic allowed major companies to protect their interests with ships that were in effect war vessels, in order to combat the rise of pirates. And something that just has to be Republic propaganda is that it takes 4 to 6 Recusants to take out a single Venator, and 1,000 to take on a Mandator II class Star Dreadnought. The first time a Recusant was depicted was actually in the game Republic Commando, and then it was in Episode 3, followed by tons of appearances in novels and comics. As for sources, in canon we have the Visual Encyclopedia, Complete Vehicles, Rise of the Separatists, and Star Wars Armada, while Legends has the Essential Guide to Warfare, Complete Encyclopedia, Cross Sections Book, and Complete Locations. So that's it for the Recusant class Light Destroyer. If you made it this far, please hit that like button, as it really does help to promote the video, and shows me that you'd like to see more of these types of videos. Comment what you like about the Recusant, and what you'd like to see in future videos. But most important of all, remember, good AIs follow orders, and the Force will be with you, always. When the Trade Federation started to build their secret army, they had a vision of converting their enormous cargo haulers into military transports. It's hard to overestimate how enormous this ship is, and just how many droids and vehicles could fit inside. For this video, we've hacked into a Vulture droid to give us a tour of a Lucrehulk over Ryloth, but we'll also use some schematics and information gathered through the HoloNet. With all this information, we'll be able to review its overall size, speed, armament, and complement of droids and ships. We'll also look at some of its flaws, and how its role changed over the course of the Clone Wars. Let's start by looking at some of the raw stats on its size. At a length of 3,170 meters, or nearly 2 miles, it was nearly twice the length of the Imperial Star Destroyer. Even its width of 3,009 meters, or 1.86 miles, meant that it was more than 2 Venators across. And just its height alone was 1,029 meters, or 0.63 miles, making it taller than a Victory-class Star Destroyer is long, and nearly the same height as 4 Venators stacked on top of each other. If it arrived on Earth, it would be nearly as wide as Manhattan, and more than twice the height of the Empire State Building. But all those numbers really just meant one very important thing, that it could haul a lot of stuff. If we fly by some of the hangar bays, you can see how small the C-9979 landing ship looks sitting inside of the Lucrehulk. 50 of these landing craft could be internally docked, essentially allowing a whole planetary invasion fleet to be moved through hyperspace with this one massive ship. The Lucrehulk had a Class 2 hyperdrive, which is quite impressive as that's the same speed as some starfighters, faster than many cargo ships, while being tied with an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. So though the C-9979 didn't have a hyperdrive, 50 of them could just pop up in your atmosphere in no time. The real crazy stats come in when you start to look at what would be carried inside of these landing craft. Each one could transport 11 MTTs, 114 AATs, and 28 platoon attack crafts. Times that by 50, and we get a stunning 550 MTTs, 5,700 AATs, and 1,400 PACs. And the Trade Federation even used some extra space in these hangars to store some additional tanks, which were a variety of NR N99 Snail tanks, and usually an extra 550 armored assault tanks. I didn't even mention the battle droids yet, which usually included 139,000 battle droids. One potential problem could have been a long queue of ships, as all these landing craft were stuck behind each other waiting to fly out of the hangar bays. But remember, this was originally a trade ship. Time is money, even in the galaxy far, far away, so there are multiple bays not only lining the sides of this inner circle, but also several bays located on the main core structure. This allowed for rapid deployment of its massive armada, a feature that would become one of the CIS's most feared capabilities. During the war, it wasn't just a terror on offense, but its 4 million metric ton capacity meant that a single Lucrehulk could resupply a huge portion of CIS assets. Back with our tour guide, we can fly around these structures jutting out near the circle's opening. These first 2 larger clamps can be used to attach the Lucrehulk to both planetary and space repair stations, or to hold allied capital ships like the Providence or Munificent class in place while assets are transferred. Moving deeper, you'll see these additional series of smaller clamps that are of different shapes to accommodate a wide variety of medium-sized ships. You might have noticed these 2 large areas bulging out on top here, and these are the long arrays of tractor beam projectors used to guide ships safely into the hangar or into one of the clamps. Because this opening is the main traffic area, the core sphere is ideally located, with the control bridge tower located right up top here. These dishes allowed for communication with a large amount and wide variety of different ships, with space traffic control also assisted by these side bridge towers that give a great view of the hangar bays on the inside of the ring. Flying around, down, and into the core, we see this area houses a main reactor. By taking a look at the schematics, we can see that this area houses a series of power generator assemblies, and above this area is the main droid control computer systems. This section connects the center sphere to the circle, but it also houses additional reactors and generators, leading up to a pair of main reactors for the engines. You can't see the second one in this image, but there are two of these, the starboard side one being right over here. What's crazy is that with all this power generation, the Trade Federation still had to install extra power generators throughout the hangar just so they could charge up their starfighter complement. In an amazingly efficient use of space, its 1500 Vulture droid complement could lock into recharge racks located in the ceiling of the hangar bay. Stored like bats, they hung above the C-9979s, allowing them to load and unload without these fighters being in the way. All this makes it a bit ironic that it would be a Vulture droid that accidentally sends Anakin's fighters spinning into the Lucrehulk's hangar bay. Anakin fires at these added reactors put in place to charge the Vultures, an explosion that would set off a chain reaction blowing up these charge stations spread throughout the ring. This eventually set off the reactors that lined that connection area, and right up into the core. Remember, that is where the droid control computers are located, along with its crew up in those bridge towers. Those would have contained a staff of 25 OOM pilot droids, which were designated by their blue coloring, along with at least 10 organic supervisors, almost always Neimoidians. Though it should be pointed out that later T-Series droids were allowed to command Lucrehulks during the Clone Wars. When this core was destroyed, the droid computer stopped sending its signal, which was transmitted down to the B-1 battle droids via its 16 signal stations. These dishes rounding the circle were all assisted by these spires, and the largest dish on the Lucrehulk located at the rear. These transmission towers act like enormous antennas, and when all this tech got blown up, the battle droids collapsed. The original B-1s had all of their movements directed by the Lucrehulk, but this disaster on Naboo caused the later CIS to implement battle droids with an internal droid AI. They would still receive their orders from CIS leaders, but could figure out novel ways to carry out those missions if the orders stopped coming. Going past this main sensor array, we can see the engines, which were all produced by Rendili Star Drive. Despite how large they are, its top atmospheric speed was only 500 km per hour, or 311 miles per hour, about half the speed of the Imperial Star Destroyer and Venator. Now, because it was not designed as a military ship, there are some design shortcomings. Although there are 42 quad turbo laser emplacements, there are some areas of the ship that are not defended, and the ones located on the inside of the ring run the fear of missing their target and firing into the Lucrehulk itself. This is a problem that is made even worse by the fact that the core contains the reactors, the larger of the power generator assemblies, and the control bridge. That is a lot of trust to put into your automated targeting systems, so let's hope they have better targeting programming than the B-1s. Though I am making it a bit worse than it sounds, as the core was protected by an incredibly powerful deflector shield generator, something you can actually see when the Naboo starfighters couldn't damage this area.
The deflector shield is too strong!
But still, you don't want to be firing into your own shields with powerful quad turbo lasers. At the end of the day though, the Lucrehulk was one of the most useful ships in the history of the galaxy, and definitely crucial to the CIS war effort. During the Clone War, they would be seen in major battles, and often used as planetary blockades. These things did have a Class 2 hyperdrive, so even when the war came to an official end, some opportunists made these disappear into obscure parts of the galaxy. Some became Separatist holdouts, while one was actually used in a failed attack on the Death Star, and even as a rebel training ground. And this Lucrehulk Flight Academy was actually commanded by General Hera Syndulla. We will cover these surviving Lucrehulks in a separate video, but you definitely want to hear some cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Its name, Lucrehulk, comes from the word lucrative, which means to make a lot of profit, and although it first appeared in The Phantom Menace, its stats were later revealed in the Episode 1 Cross-Sections book, and other Star Wars source books. And although there is no official cost, there are some sources that point out that on the black market, you could get one for 40 million credits. And a neat little detail is that supposedly, each of those quad turbolaser turrets could recess back into the ship, useful during that time when the Trade Federation was starting to use these as warships, but didn't want to give away these retrofittings. So that's it for the Lucrehulk. I think this is one of the most important ships in the CIS, but let me know what you guys think about it in the comments down below. Do you like the ship's design? Was it a great way to move a ton of assets at once, or was it too much stored on a single ship? But most important of all, remember, the Lucrehulk is the Russian nesting doll of the CIS, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is all about a Trade Federation cruiser that once helped the Jedi and carried a squadron of their A6 interceptors. Though the bridge and look of the sides is similar to the Lucrehulk, it was not produced by Horish Kessel Drive, but instead by Kuat Drive Yards. KDY would later make nearly all of the Republic's war vessels, directly producing things like the Venator and Arquitens, but also the Juggernaut and ATTE through their subsidiary Rathana Heavy Engineering. But nearly 200 years before the Clone Wars, the Trade Defense Force purchased several of these carriers along with Munificent-class cruisers. They were deployed to the Recusant sector to confront pirates that had been harassing a system that had just entered into the Trade Federation. This confrontation would foreshadow the Stark Hyperspace War of 44 BBY. The Stark Commercial Combine was a band of smugglers, pirates, mercenaries, bounty hunters, and assassins who all worked together to challenge the Trade Federation. Their leader took advantage of a crisis at a Bacta facility to launch his band into galactic infamy. A major explosion at the galaxy's primary Bacta production plant dramatically reduced the supply of the healing blue liquid that was vital to so many medical procedures. Core worlds consolidated all their Bacta and tried to buy up reserves, but most Outer Rim worlds couldn't afford it at the new high prices. The fleets of the SCC would raid Bacta shipments meant for the core and sell them throughout the Outer Rim at prices that were lower than anyone else could. Because the Trade Federation had the largest trade network across the galaxy, it was their Captor-class ships that were often transporting the blue gold. Its internal areas in these arms could be filled with cargo, but it would increasingly be filled with fighters and droids made for the Trade Defense Force. When attacked, these droid fighters could rapidly deploy from this central hangar, but the Federation just wasn't powerful enough at this time to repel a coordinated attack by a gang of hardened criminals. That is why the Republic had to get involved, as the TF demanded that either the Jedi and Judicial forces destroy the Stark Commercial Combine, or they would be forced to stop trade and let the TDF become a fully operational military. To prevent this, the Republic dedicated several corvettes and fighters, but the real blow to Stark's operation came when the Trade Federation allowed the use of several Captors to launch a surprise attack. Dozens of A6 interceptors that had both Republic pilots and Jedi were deployed at a stunning speed from the Trade Federation's carrier. So just 8 years before the blockade over Naboo, the Federation and Jedi were working as close allies. But this ship's relationship with the Republic would actually continue up through 29 BBY, when Wraith Sinar was assigned one by Will of Tarkin. The ship was named the Admiral Corvin and was considered old by this time, but with its complement, we can get a rough estimate of the Captor's size. During a mission to Zonama Sekot, this ship contained 30 Vulture droids, 3,000 B-1 battle droids, an unknown amount of E-5 battle droids, 100 human troops, and 3 C-9979 landing craft. Even if we ignore the space the droids would have taken up, as they could be densely packed on racks, and the Vultures could probably hang from the ceiling like they did in the Lucrehulk, just the landing craft would have required this hangar to be around 400 meters wide. The problem with that is that we get insane dimensions for this thing, like 3,200 meters long and 1,800 meters wide, which would make it about twice the dimensions of the Imperial Star Destroyer. Instead, I think we just have to assume that the C-9979 wasn't fully assembled inside of this ship, like with what we see in the core ship's cross-section. If we look at this lineup, I believe we get a much more reasonable reference. We would get a length of 544.5 meters or 1,786 feet, which was about 2/3 a Munificent, and about 1/3 an Imperial Star Destroyer. And at a width of 340 meters or 1,116 feet, it was more than twice the width of the Recusant class light destroyer. While at a height of 276 meters or 906 feet, it was actually taller than the Venator. If it were to show up here on Earth, it would be about 1.5 times the length of the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, about half the height of the One World Trade Center building, and 1.5 times the width of the Great Pyramid. So you can see that even with these smaller dimensions, it is easy to picture all of these droids and ships fitting into this thing, as long as the landing craft had a novel way of leaving the hangar. After this ship's use by Wraith Sinar, we don't ever again hear of its use by either the Republic or the Trade Federation. I would assume this is because the CIS had a bunch of other good carriers by this time, and the Captor class had been around for about 200 years by the time of the Clone Wars. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The ship's first appearance is in the comic Star Wars Republic 36, and the Sinar story comes from the novel Rogue Planet. Additional details come from the Essential Guide to Warfare, which first named it as the Heavy Munitions Carrier. There are mods for Empire at War that feature a similar design, with artists that I have linked to in the description. Also, I found this ship in the comic, which looks like it was definitely designed similar to the Captor, but has this kind of C-70 looking bridge and more engines. I don't know what it is, but definitely let me know if you do in the comments down below. The closest thing I have is that Tarkin once had a former Trade Federation ship known as the Rim Merchant Inim, which was said to be a smaller cousin of the Lucrehulk. Then there's also this diplomatic cruiser that has these extra escape pods, so I could use some help identifying this one too. But most important of all, remember, beware the Trade Federation haulers bearing Jedi interceptors, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is all about the core ships used by the CIS. This version of the core ship existed for over 100 years before the time of the Clone Wars, being used by the Neimoidians for trade across the galaxy. It's actually surprisingly tied to Neimoidian culture. Their species are known for being cutthroat in their ambition, with some biologists believing that this is instilled in them from the time as larval grubs, with their parents giving the hives a small amount of food. This caused the grubs to fight to the death for scraps, and this mentality was reinforced in their school system and up through adulthood. They developed these core ships around the layouts of their hives, with different levels being occupied by Neimoidians of different status. The executives and dignitaries would occupy these upper towers, being able to command the core ship from this bridge. As you move down the levels, you go through the lower rungs of Neimoidian society, with engineering decks, mechanics, and ending on janitors and droids. You would never see high-ranking Neimoidians walking around in these lower levels. Because the purpose of this ship is to transport goods across the galaxy, giving and receiving goods from various worlds, it has many loading bays and boarding tubes to accommodate many types of alien ships. For example, this is a docking ring that can accommodate Corellian ships of any size. Its interior space amounted to a cargo capacity of 66 million cubic meters, or 2.3 billion feet cubed. It is hard to compare that to other Star Wars ships since the stat that is usually given is just the weight, but for a real-world comparison, let's look at the largest container vessel on Earth. You could fit about 85 OOCL Hong Kongs into a single core ship, which would come out to 1,820,000 of these 20-foot containers. And there are no stats for how many MTTs, AATs, and C9979s could fit inside of this thing, but just based on the raw space, you could fit 33,000 MTTs. But of course that number would be a lot less since they can't occupy every cubic inch, but keep in mind that they could be stored inside of the C9979 landing craft. Speaking of which, this is a really cool shot where you can see how that ship is transported, where they take off those wide side wings. These would be assembled either in the Lucrehulk or in one of these hangar bays on the side when it was time for some illegal planetary blockade action. This core ship would have to set down in specialized landing pits, with the feet extending out from the ball itself. Its thrust exits via a single massive exhaust, and at the bottom of this pit, there is a 4-mile deep hole into which the liftoff thrust is harmlessly channeled away from the support structure. This is done with real-world starships too, and they're even adding water for sound suppression, though of course on a much smaller scale. To help hold up all of this weight, it takes advantage of a series of massive repulsor lifts. The same tech that lets things float in the Star Wars universe can be used in massive cargo haulers in order to offset the effects of varying weight when the core ship goes in and out of different atmospheres and gravities. There are even gravitational reflectors that line the landing pit, which helps to increase this effect when the core ships are sitting down for long periods of time. If we move back inside of the ship, we can see the enormous reactor with fuel reserves encircling it on the bottom. And then newer secondary fuel silos were located on the top levels to help address some overloading issues, and there are even these ancillary reactors located on different decks. Though these look like Imperial Star Destroyer shield generators, they are actually just massive balls of fuel. The shields are generated by a series of these cylinders located on the mid-levels. These shields are incredibly strong when inside of the pit, having extra shield cyclers that it draws on, but even when separated, it is strong enough to fend off turbolaser attacks from even capital ships. I know the first time we see one, it is being melted apart by SPHAs, but that just shows how powerful those walkers are. It was getting hit repeatedly by 4 SPHAs just laying into it, eventually cutting the fuel lines to the reactor, which of course cut off its thrusters. Remember, it was just a single SPHA laser retrofitted inside of the Venator's ventral hangar bay that was able to take out a Munificent class frigate with a single hit. Of course, the core ship was much larger, at 696 meters or 2,283 feet across, meaning you could nearly stretch 2 Munificents across it, and was more than 100 meters wider than the Venator. At 914 meters or 3,000 feet tall, it was about 3.5 Venators high, or nearly a Munificent stood end to end with a Zillo Beast standing on top. All of this required a pretty substantial crew, with 60 Trade Federation supervisors, 3,000 droid operators, and 200,000 maintenance droids that came to replace those lower-level Neimoidian laborers. It could also transport 60,000 passengers, with most of these suites being very upscale to meet with potential trade clients. In order to ensure a great HoloNet connection, they have one of the best hyperwave transmitters money can buy, which is picked up by the transmitters in the main spire. These enormous dishes were added to control the droid army, and are the same sort that are found on the Lucrehulk. Speaking of that enormous cargo hauler turned battleship carrier, after the Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo, the Republic forced them to disassemble the Lucrehulk. But the Trade Federation was able to just detach the core. So they would dump the arms and main engine out in space, travel down to the planet's landing pit, and then just fly back out and reconnect with the body to become a Lucrehulk. We don't have a figure for its top atmospheric speed, but we do get a 300G acceleration, which is 1/10 that of the Venator. During the opening battle of the Clone Wars, we saw that one was shot down by SPHAs, but concurrent to this was a squad of elite clone commandos that were able to infiltrate a core ship, get the launch codes, and then block that signal to all other core ships. By grounding them on Geonosis, this deprived the enemy of a substantial amount of CIS assets right at the beginning of the war. Later core ships were modified, taking it up from 280 point defense laser cannons to 21 quad point defense laser batteries, 48 assault laser cannons, and 3 turbolasers. But then there were certain variants that had even more turbolasers added, and dedicated their entire cargo capacity to starfighters. 2 of these models were seen during the Battle of Rendili, where they were able to hold off a pair of Acclamator-class assault ships. It wasn't until a 3rd Acclamator and 5 Dreadnought-class cruisers arrived that these core ships were finally destroyed. Then there were also some variants like Skytop Station, which changed it inside and out to be an enormous listening post. This thing was headed by a crew of expert slicers from the Hyper Communications Cartel. With their expertise in this amazing piece of technology, they could both encrypt CIS transmissions and hack into Republic transmissions sent via hyperwave and on the HoloNet. Another modified core ship was the Unlimited project found on Utapau. This had a ton of listening equipment as well, but also added a variety of landing pads and staging areas, while also operating as a meeting place for CIS leadership. After the Clone Wars ended, unlike most CIS assets that were just destroyed or incorporated into the Imperial military, some core ships were sold off to the Corporate Sector Authority, one of the few places in the galaxy that retained its autonomy under the Empire. As far as I could find in all the sources on the HoloNet, it appears that this is the final resting place for this century-old line of Neimoidian transports. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. It appeared in a ton of video games, not limited to Jedi Starfighter, Battlefronts both old and new, and it was in the comics Republic 67 through 72. It was also in a ton of different novels. And the stats come from the Star Wars Complete Cross-Sections and New Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels. So that's it for the core ship, but most important of all, remember, the core ship ain't weak, it's just that the SPHA's a beast. And the Force will be with you, always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is all about the DH Omni support vessel, also known as the Separatist supply ship. It was manufactured by Horish Kessel Drive Incorporated, the same people that gave us the Lucrehulk class battleship and Munificent class star frigate. The exact cost of this massive ship is unknown, but at a length of 908.78 meters, or 2,982 feet, it was about 2 Zillo Beasts shorter than the Venator-class Star Destroyer, and 1.5 times the length of the Leviathan that was used during the time of the Old Republic. At a width of 1,257 meters, or 4,125 feet, it was wider than an Imperial Star Destroyer, and about 3 Munificent-class frigates across. While at a height of 910.35 meters, or 2,987 feet, it was more than 25 ATM-6s tall, or about the same height as 526 Senates. This gave it plenty of room for a massive cargo capacity of 5 million metric tons, a weight greater than 16 Zillo Beasts. And its complement of ships is vaguely described as multiple C-9979 landing craft, but as its width is about 1/6 as wide as the supply ship, and the fact that this transport has a lot of negative space in the middle, it can't be too many C-99s. Because we can see the main hangar bays that stretch the length of this ship are about 6 Umbaran starfighters wide, or about 90 meters, even with the shrunken down cannon stats of the C-99, which was 60 meters from bow to stern, you would have to fly in sideways through a curved hangar bay. There may have been other areas where they might have been stacked, and deployed somewhere from these sides, but we can't be talking more than a handful of C-99s on the Separatist supply ship. Instead, just like the name suggests, it was for resupplying the CIS forces, and in this main hangar, we see a ton of smaller bays, and loading cranes on the ceiling. This ship would usually be packed full of deactivated droids, Tabana gas for blasters and laser cannons, additional power cells for those weapons, along with grenades, missiles, mounted guns, prefabricated bases, various tools, and food and drink for the organics that also made up the CIS war machine. When High Command was worried that this station might be attacked, they could pack it full of starfighters like Hyena bombers and Vulture droids, who could also just attach themselves to the exterior in order not to get in the way of all the loading bays, making for something like a terrifying version of a ball of bees. Additional defensive measures were in the form of hundreds of small point defense laser cannons, which were specifically designed to take out quick-moving small starfighters. Although these were normally anchors in CIS flotillas above a planet, they could easily evade if they needed to, via its Class 6 hyperdrive. Because this ship was not intended to be used in combat, its crew is relatively light, with just a few pilot battle droids, along with a single T-Series tactical droid, who would command the entire facility. This overseer would spend most of his time directing the thousands of battle droids that worked to load supplies onto docked ships, but the T-Series was also expected to safely get this ship out of danger in the rare event of a Republic attack. As for its history, like most ships used by the CIS, it was converted from a civilian cargo transport and was quickly recognized by Dooku and Grievous as the best way to make up for the cargo capacity restrictions of some of their battleships. Though we normally think of the droid army not needing any food, the CIS did have numerous organic allies, and certainly in the places that they conquered. So when Dooku wanted to come off as some noble dissenter to a corrupt republic, he often used this ship to bring aid to worlds that he one day hoped would become a part of the CIS. The supply ships set over Umbara and 21 BBY were serving in this function, as well as providing things like long-range missiles to the Umbaran militia forces that were still trying to resist Republic rule after clone troopers seized their capital. A Republic fleet was unable to destroy the supply ship due to its massive escort, but Fives, Jesse, and Hardcase defied orders from Jedi General Pong Krell and used stolen Umbaran starfighters to get past the CIS's defenses. The battle droids were unable to determine that these were not friendlies until they had already entered the ship, and even with the ray shielding being raised by the T-Series droid, Hardcase was able to manually pass through to the reactor core, where he sacrificed himself to destroy this crucial station. Stuck without supplies, the Umbarans were forced to hand over their cities to the Republic. On other fronts, at least 5 of these were stationed over Sereno, where Dooku's palatial headquarters were located, and General Grievous brought 2 of them to Dathomir to support his conquer of the Night Sisters. And the last time we see them being used is in the year 20 BBY, when Dooku launched an attack on the Banking Clan stronghold on the planet Scipio. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. It was created for the Clone Wars TV show by using assets from cargo containers from the episode Senate Murders, fuel pipes from the Zillo Beast episode, and lamps from the Zillo Beast Strikes Back. The ship that was going to be supplying the Umbarans was originally going to be a Lucrehulk, but George Lucas asked Dave Filoni to change it in order to make the Trade Federation appear more neutral, as it might be weird for the audience to see it as a Trade Federation ship, and then see the Trade Federation Neimoidians in the Senate. And shout out to whoever cared enough about this ship's stats over at LucasArts, as even with major ships like the X-Wing, we don't have an official width and height stat, and the TIE Fighter's dimensions have changed over the years. Then stuff like the Mon Cala cruiser stats are notoriously debated. But with the Separatist supply ship, we get all 3 dimensions clearly stated, to the point of actually having 2 decimal places. Just something really cool that I thought you guys would appreciate, and I wish we saw a lot more of. So that's it for the Separatist supply ship, but most important of all, remember, without supplies, you don't have an army, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is about one of the CIS's more obscure superweapons, the Shadow Blade, a ship that was never destroyed and whose whereabouts are still unknown. This didn't fire a giant energy beam that could turn planets into dust, or generate a massive ion ring that could disable whole fleets. It would just alter a few electronics while it kept itself cloaked. There are actually still no images of this ship, and all accounts come from a single mission undertaken by Jedi Master Darish Jet. But this is what it may have looked like. It is described as being painted completely black, with no visible armament, though several turbolasers were concealed behind panels to be deployed if this vessel was ever discovered. The deep black helped to conceal it in the darkness of space, while the smooth hull assisted in its cloaking tech. Like the Republic stealth ship, it could go completely invisible to both scanners and the naked eye, but likewise it also had to decloak when engaging its weapons. Inside of this ship had a small portion of energy dedicated for the turbolasers, but the rest was nearly entirely dedicated to its superweapon, the Hyperpoint Destabilizer. That may not sound intimidating, but consider the fact that every ship crossing the galaxy relies on hyper routes. Without this faster-than-light workaround, it would take thousands or even millions of years to go in between rims, let alone across the entire galaxy. At a time of galactic war, both the CIS and Republic relied on their ability to quickly scramble fleets to the nearest attack. When plotting a hyperspace destination, you're often given a number of jumps. 10 jumps means that there are 10 times that you will come out of hyperspace to make course corrections. Turn a little at hyperpoint 3 so that you're lined up for point 4, and so on. So these points along the hyper route are vulnerable areas where the ships are coming out of the hyper and back into real space. Military strategists had always seen this as a weak point, and likewise these areas of space are often protected by their own fleets and/or permanent space stations along the major routes. Smaller hyper routes would often have pirates sitting at remote hyperpoints, but at least the major routes connecting the galaxy were still safe. Even if these points were to be attacked, emergency alerts would be sent out to all ships that would prevent them from making the jump to the contested point. What CIS engineers had to do was find a way to both sit in these hyperpoints without being detected, and disrupt the readings from incoming ships while they were making their way through hyperspace. This would essentially cut off this area of space from all reinforcements, but was thought to be impossible. Then again, if anyone could pull it off, it would be the CIS. Remember, it was engineers allied with the CIS that originally developed the Death Star, along with the Malevolence and Malevolence II. The Republic scientists just took over the Death Star project once the CIS was defeated. With this marvel of engineering, the CIS could disrupt the hyperpoint so that all traveling through could not re-emerge there. The pilots wouldn't even be aware that they had overshot the point, and that they were now careening towards a mass shadow. Some ships would not respond quick enough, being ripped out of the hyper and smashing into a real space object. And the ships that could avoid that fate were still light years off course, and still unable to ever exit at that intended point. If you watched our video on the CB-3 Cortosis droid, you know that some top-secret CIS projects were started without Sidious even knowing. But though the Shadow Blade seemed like it would ensure a CIS victory and ruin Palpatine's chance at becoming Emperor, he did know about the project and went through great lengths to protect it. Jedi spies had come across something codenamed Starkiller, and in 20 BBY they discovered that the superweapon was still being constructed, located on the mid-rim planet Chromus. By the time the Jedi caught wind of it, the weapons were said to be operational, and all that was missing was some paneling and shielding. Informants got it down to the planet, but no specific on-world location was known. Realizing the terrifying ability of the ship, the Jedi ordered Jedi Master Darish Jet to take a fleet and neutralize it. Palpatine made sure to inform the Jedi how crucial it was that this mission was a success, while secretly he hoped to use the resulting massacre to destroy the reputation of the Jedi Order. As Sidious, he was able to clandestinely manipulate the targeting computers and scanners on Jet's command ship, named the Maelstrom. After destroying the planet's fleet of CIS ships, false readings from their scanner led them to a construction bay that was located deep under the capital city of Chromus. It appeared that the CIS were willing to use civilians as shields, and as ground units reported that a large ship was preparing to leave from this underground facility, Jet made the difficult decision. Knowing that countless trillions could be lost if the evil CIS were to win this war, the Jedi Master ordered an orbital bombardment on this densely populated city. Millions were killed instantly, but the destruction of this underground weapons base set off a series of secondary explosions that disrupted the entire planet's tectonics. Reverberations would last for months, turning Chromus into a hellscape that swallowed up cities in massive earthquakes, flooded others in tsunamis, and rained down lava from countless volcanoes. As the death toll went into the billions, the Jedi Master's only consolation was that the superweapon had been destroyed. But of course, Sidious was not outsmarted. Remember that he had sliced the ship's scanners and targeting, so that where Jet fired was not the Shadow Blade's precise location. The superweapon just escaped out of another port after engaging its cloaking devices, leaving another ship to be destroyed, along with highly explosive material that set off the chain reaction. Dooku and the CIS pointed to this tragedy as proof that the Republic was evil, and Emperor Palpatine would be able to play on the memory of this event as just one of the many troubling acts that foreshadowed the Jedi's treason. But although thought destroyed, it seems the Force haunted Jet with dreams that made him suspicious about the Shadow Blade's destruction. A year would pass, and we are now in the final days of the Clone Wars, with the CIS eager to see this ship in use. Their first target was the Kularan system. By letting the Force guide him, the Jedi Master felt himself drawn to this area as well. On the way to this system, the Jedi were betrayed via Order 66. His small cruiser was manned by allies of the Republic, not clones, and when he got the emergency transmission from Obi-Wan, he knew that some hand had been guiding his actions all along. That his suspicions that he and the Jedi had been set up, and that the superweapon still survived, were true. He trusted that the Force had brought him to Kularan to finish the fight and deny the Emperor his Shadow Blade. As he emerged at the hyperpoint, he saw a pair of Republic gunboats shooting down a vessel containing a survivor of Order 66. Jet engaged the two ships, allowing this unknown Jedi to escape, though the Maelstrom was severely damaged. But he suspected that this was all in the Force's plans. He understood that he was being watched, and that the cloaked CIS ship took great joy at watching Republic forces tear each other apart. Exaggerating his ship's damage, he started to cut power to the engines and turn off the shields as he drifted towards the planet's asteroid belt. The commander of the Shadow Blade decided that this would be the perfect time to test its turbolasers, decloaked and lowered its shields in order to fire. In an instant, the Maelstrom's shields re-engaged, and its full array of tractor beams grabbed hold of the superweapon. He knew that the CIS commander would have already re-engaged his shield, and that the Maelstrom's weapons could not damage it, but by setting the thrusters to full power, the Jedi set both of them on a collision course for the asteroids. But the Force had one more trick up its sleeve. As they careened toward mutual destruction, they passed through a temporal disturbance, a tear in space-time that was generated by the ancient Sith. The Dreadmasters had once wielded a weapon that could do this, but where these two ships vanished to, if one can even survive in that dark side plane, are still mysteries to this day. Let me know if you think the Shadow Blade or the idea of these warp spaces will come back into canon. This comes from the short story Dark Soul back in 2005. The codename Starkiller comes from Luke's original name in the Star Wars script, and was the basis for Starkiller in the Force Unleashed game, and the superweapon in The Force Awakens. But that's it for the Shadow Blade. But most important of all, remember, never underestimate CIS engineers, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, MetaNerds? In this video we're going to be taking an in-depth look at one of the most convenient ways to conquer a planet, the C-9979 landing craft. We'll go over its original use by the Trade Federation, work our way through its time as the backbone of the CIS invasion fleet, and of course do a complete breakdown, seeing exactly what made it such a reliable piece in the Separatist movement. Let's take a look back before the Clone Wars to get a better idea of the C-9979 and its role in galactic history. Right before the infamous invasion of Naboo that would kickstart the Sith's grand plan, Howard Charles Engineering, a subsidiary of the Techno Union, was contacted by the Nymordians of the Trade Federation to produce a series of vehicles for their schemes. This would be one of those vehicles, and in a short time, the Zychar would see their creations spread like a virus throughout the galaxy in total war. The first time we see these craft in action was the aforementioned blockade, and later invasion of Naboo led by Newt Gunray and his Trade Federation. Painted in the unassuming dull brown of the company, his massive landing vehicles would descend on the landing zone, deploy their droid forces, unloading an army large enough to scare Queen Amidala and her people into signing the treaty. It is during this invasion that we get an interesting look at a tactic used by the Trade Federation, and which would be picked up by the CIS, using a triangular formation of 3 ships during an attack. These craft would land strategically between major cities and deploy their vast array of droids, allowing a swift cutoff of supplies and reinforcements for the defenders. The TF applied this strategy to the whole world, isolating the city of Oxen and securing it before launching a full-fledged assault on the capital of Theed. Each of these would pour out MTTs, AATs, droids, and STAPs, hoping to overwhelm in sheer numbers. At least that was the plan. As we know, through the courage of Padme, the skills of the Jedi, secret amphibious Sith, and with a little luck from Anakin, the invasion of Naboo would be a total disaster for Gunray and his associates. Following this failure to truly conquer Naboo, many of these landing craft would be captured by the Royal Naboo Security Volunteers, as well as the Gungans, and were either scrapped, turned over to the Republic, or taken as a prize, being used as civilian cargo transports. We don't see much from this craft over the next 10 years, as tensions were rising and the Trade Federation would become one of the major members of the CIS, and the only other time we see it before the outbreak of the Clone Wars was during the Battle of Nod Kartha. Legends say it was a skirmish between the Jedi who backed the local resistance against the Trade Federation. The forces of good would come out victorious in that conflict, right before the galaxy was thrown into chaos. Seceding from the Galactic Republic under the leadership of Count Dooku, the newly formed Separatist alliance would once more call upon the C-9979 to serve as the primary transport for its armor and troops. Painted in the colors of the CIS, blue and gray, and anointed with the symbol of their cause, this vehicle would see use on countless worlds, and even the capital planet of Coruscant would see these monsters landing on its city streets, unloading hundreds of thousands of droids into combat for the capture of Chancellor Sidious. Darth Palpatine. The Senate. A very noteworthy use of this landing craft was actually not the battle between clone and droid, but a scornful encounter between the CIS and the Night Sisters of Dathomir. Here we see these landing craft deliver the Bane of Talzin, as her clan's doom is delivered via the 9979. We see its wreckage across many worlds as well. When the Clone Wars came to a sudden end following the execution of the Separatist Council, the use of the C-9979 appears to have come to an end. The Empire certainly had no use for them, and being as big and laborious as they weren't a good fit for the growing alliance. And so it fell into scrap piles and into galactic history. With the history of this beast in the books, let's take a closer look at the specifications that made this vehicle so useful. As we've previously mentioned, this landing craft was one of the many vehicles produced by the soon-to-be Confederacy by Howchar Engineering Corporation. The Zychar that made up this company are a fanatical insectoid-like species whose religion centers around the construction of high-precision machinery. To get a brand new landing craft, you'd have to shell out 12 million credits. That's enough coin to buy you 100 MTTs or 300 Vulture droids. But what did all those credits get you? Well, it's quite a lot in fact. Measuring at a length of 210 meters or 688 feet, it would stretch over 2 football fields, or over 4 A6 juggernauts placed end to end. With a towering height of 24.6 meters or 80 feet, this thing would be over 2 MTTs tall, about the height of 2 Brachiosaurus, or 98 buzz droids in their ball form. Powered by ion engines, this ship would reach a max speed of 587 km per hour or 364 miles per hour, and while certainly not slow, landing craft isn't going to win many races, and it would get lapped by other transport ships out there. The Imperial Sentinel shuttle clocks in with a top speed of 1,000 km per hour, and even the Alliance GR-75 gets up to 650. But of course, the C-9979 is the largest. It does come equipped with a Class 2 hyperdrive, the same ones found in the imposing Lucrehulk. And remember, these transports are rarely out on their own, just in case they happen to be separated from the main fleet, and even if it took damage, it did have a backup Class 15 hyperdrive. Incredibly slow, but enough so you could disappear through the blue void. Coming stocked with impressive long-range sensors and shielding, it didn't have to pray to the mechanized bug gods to survive battle, as it even had 4 dorsal-mounted twin laser cannons and 2 wing-mounted twin heavy laser cannons, in case it ever needed to dish out some damage to incoming corvettes or fighters. This armament with the sensors and shielding allowing it to hold its own until reinforcements could back it up. To crew this behemoth, it would take 231 crew, with 88 of those being automated battle droids, while the other 143 being enlisted organic officers and crew. Which is really rare for the CIS, and why so many actual life forms were needed is a mystery that only the Neimoidians or Zychar could answer. But since this is a transport first and foremost, how much cargo could it actually hold? And how many battle droids? Well, it could move 5,500 tons of cargo, depending on the configuration deployed, which is 11 million pounds, the same weight of 846 African elephants, great for toppling the Cosmic Rome, or 3,142 Rancors. It carries a massive 2,500 battle droids and droidicas. When it comes to vehicles, buckle up because it can carry 114 AATs, 1 mobile command center, 11 MTTs, 22 platoon attack craft, and an unspecified amount of NR and N99 Persuader class droid enforcers, 8 Hydroid Medusas, and 144 Vulture droid starfighters. depending on how you wanted to configure it. So as you can see, this transport certainly packs a punch, and if you have 10 or 20 of these things deployed from the control ships blockading your world, the sheer amount of arms and armor would seem uncontestable. So once this thing landed, how exactly was this army deployed? Let's break down this process from takeoff to touchdown. Usually deployed from the hangars of Lucrehulks, it would clear the atmosphere before beginning its landing cycle in the designated landing zone. In the final moments before landing on the planet's surface, massive repulsor lifts would activate to keep the ship steady, making use of super magnum anti-gravity coils, making sure the ship would stay true to course and stable when its landing gear deployed and hit the ground. All of these precautions when landing this massive craft may seem like overkill, but when this many assets are at stake, one can never be too cautious. Imagine the financial loss this would be for the Neimoidians. And it shows that the technology in the Star Wars galaxy, while certainly fantastical, is not magic and does in fact attempt to make some sense. With all these overlapping systems, it makes me wonder if repulsor lifts are subject to a real-world phenomenon called the vortex ring state, an aerodynamic condition in which a vortex ring forms around the rotor, causing a severe and often irreversible loss in lift capability. Maybe the Hyperspace encountered similar issues in previous designs and implemented more measures to ensure a steady and safe landing. But following that landing, perimeter field sensors would scan the surrounding area for landmines or other hazards that could cause issues in the deployment process. And once in the clear, the gargantuan doors would swing open and the drop ramp would be let down. Out first would be the pre-staged combat-ready units. This would consist of either MTTs like we see on Naboo, or AATs as we often see during the Clone Wars. Repulsor tracks that lined the staging area, as they were too big and unwieldy to navigate inside of these wings without assistance. These tracks would lead the armor from the inner wings where they were stored for transport to the staging area above the main gate. The transport clamps would assist the vehicles in being lowered to the ramp for deployment onto the battlefront. This process was not quick, and depending on how many vehicles needed to be deployed, the entire process could take upwards of 45 minutes. The ship also serves as a sort of command center for the Federation or Separatist forces. When an AAT used all of its ammunition, it wasn't reloaded by B-1s like their artillery is on Ryloth, but instead these tanks would return to the C-9979 and have their entire lower frame removed within the safety of the landing craft, having this bottom shovel foot part replaced with one full of more ordnance, before being sent back off into combat. While interesting, with the speed of the AAT, I'm not sure this is the most practical tactic, but this ability is extremely useful when paired with the deployment of a mobile command center, like the one we see on Felucia during Ahsoka's kidnapping. An MCC would be set up with a landing craft at its center. Tall walls, droid sentries, and a large gate made this a quick and protected way to install a base of operations for Separatist forces. Although not seen on Felucia, if you paired this center with AAT and MTT reinforcements, it would truly be a deadly way to not only launch an invasion, but keep your landing zone safe. One issue of this mobile command center, an issue fully taken advantage of by the clones on Felucia, was the lack of shielding around that base, making it extremely vulnerable to not only bombing runs and airstrikes, but from artillery as seen with the mass driver of the ATT. Having a mobile shield generator would make it almost impenetrable, but that shield would have to be deactivated to allow the landing craft to pass, as well as any repulsor tanks used by the Seps, while Republic walkers would just be able to storm right in. When not in use, the C-9979 would be broken down, with its massive wings stored separately from the body to prevent unnecessary strain to the vehicle. When in operation, the wings were attached to this main body via specialized tensor fields to prevent them from sagging under their own weight, or even breaking off mid-flight. And this ship does have one known variant, the nicely named C-9969 landing craft, which was mentioned in the new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels. It's essentially the same ship, but is said to be slightly larger, just allowing for even more armored vehicles to be carried into battle. So that's it for the breakdown, but check out these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. First entered the galaxy via the Phantom Menace novelization, and of course was soon seen in the film. Being the main mode of transport for the CIS, it's made its way into comics, games, books, and TV shows. Both Clone Wars and The Clone Wars feature this ship, with the version in the latter being surprisingly undersized. It's caused some confusion in legend and canon sourcebooks. Encyclopedia of Star Wars and Other Vehicles has different size measurements from this official databank. The same encyclopedia gives differing figures on the droid capacity of the ship, which conflicts with the more recent Rise of the Separatist book. And so even with the new canon trying to clear up some of the confusion and conflicting information covering all this stuff for decades, even newer canon material has different figures. Though the only variation is that one mentioned, which is just larger than what we see in Phantom Menace, not the smaller one we see in the Clone Wars show. The final design of this craft was drawn up by the famed Star Wars concept artist Doug Chiang, who based its look on a dragonfly, and what Lucas liked about it is that he said it reminded him of an old biplane. But that's it for the C9979. If you made it this far, please hit that like button, subscribe to see more, and check out these other videos, I'm sure you'll like them. But most important of all, remember, next time you're invading a peaceful planet, please allow for 45 minutes to deplane. And the Force will be with you. Always. Trade disputes can be resolved through diplomacy, debate, or an army. What's up, MetaNerds? Today we're going to be taking a tour of the Multi-Troop Transport, otherwise known as the MTT. We'll explore the role it played for both the Trade Federation and the CIS, delve into its cross-section, and even that time, the MTT seemingly took flight. Designed and manufactured by Bactoid Armor Workshops, the MTT was used at first by the Neimoidian-led Trade Federation. There was very little to no information about their deployment before the famous Battle of Naboo. And so before we talk history, let's take an in-depth look at the specifications of this behemoth. The Multi-Troop Transport is quite a humble name for such a monster of a machine. With a length of 35.6 meters, or approximately 117 feet long, it was longer than 19 steamrolled Gungans, but still considerably shorter than the Republic's A6 Juggernaut. And at 10.54 meters, or almost 35 feet tall, the MTT was a iota higher than 2 Fambas. Cargo-wise, it's estimated that the MTT could haul 12 tons. That's enough to haul 112 OOM battle droids, including their blasters, and still have enough energy to add 3.5 dewbacks. If one of these beasts showed up here on Earth, it would be as long as 14 smart cars, taller than 4 M1 Abrams tanks, and would have enough hauling power to transport 879 bars of gold. At a sluggish 35 kilometers per hour or only 22 miles per hour, the MTT isn't going to be winning any pod races. This speed makes it very vulnerable to attacks, which is why we always see it escorted with AATs, STAPs, and battle droids, or holding back towards the rear of the battlefront. To have an Earth comparison just so you know how truly sluggish this thing is, the record for the fastest human sprint is 28 miles per hour. But then again, Usain Bolt wasn't carrying 12 tons of nasally death.
Roger, roger.
The MTT was only armed with 2 twin blaster cannons, mounted on a rotatable ball turret on the front of the vehicle. While extremely powerful and accurate, having even been said to shoot down starfighters, the placement of these guns made the transport dangerously vulnerable from any angle besides the front. And while we're on the subject, that front of the MTT is heavily armored, and not just to protect its portable pop-up army. It could also use its rounded face as a battering ram, knocking its way through walls and trees, like we saw it doing as the Trade Federation droid army was clearing a path through the dense Naboo forest. Maybe Ventress should have brought a few of these to Ragosa. There's even more going on inside of the MTT, which we can see thanks to one incredible cross-section. Starting up at the top, we see that the MTT is piloted by a battle droid, while another serves as the gunner, something similar to what we see in the AAT. These vehicles were usually on pre-programmed paths set up by the droid control ship, but the pilot could deviate from these orders when necessary. Since the model we're looking at is the original, as we move down we can get a closer look at this vehicle's most infamous feature, the droid racks. Bactoid Armor Workshop, who also made the B1s, really took advantage of designing this thing with droids in mind, as I can't really see any other army being able to take advantage of this system. The droids were folded into the fetal position, loaded up into 4 smaller racks, and stowed away safely until duty called. The base model of MTT could carry up to 112 standard OOM battle droids, and we'll discuss the variants in just a sec. We can see here that the rack is also operated by 2 OOM battle droids, an overseer and an operator. The entire forward interior, as expected, is dominated by the MTT's main feature, and so the other essentials of this transport were housed in the back. We can see the power generating cooling systems, not to mention the many vents and fins that would make sure the MTT doesn't overheat. Interestingly, the main power generators are said to be provided by Kuat drive yards, who became known throughout the galaxy for their Republic warships. I guess when both sides are secretly run by the Sith, it doesn't really matter where the credits come from. But if you want some more information on that, we actually covered this in an old video, explaining how Kuat drive yards would have ended up in the CIS, but how Palpatine's machinations made them a vehement supporter of the Republic. Now that we've covered the original, let's quickly run down the variations. As war broke out, the methodical deployment of battle droids became increasingly obsolete. To counter this, some MTTs were outfitted with new racks to drop B1 battle droids onto the field already standing upright. While this did fix the issue with the speed of deployment, it did limit how many droids could be brought to the battlefront. This design seemed to be considered an improvement, as we see MTTs throughout the Clone Wars being used to quickly drop off super battle droids, of which it could only carry 12 at a time. We see them doing just that during the Battle of Dathomir, littering this red jungle world with dozens of clankers. This version, as well as others used by the CIS, were given a paint job to better match the blue and gray look of the Confederacy. Another time to see the MTT variant was during Wat Tambor's occupation of Ryloth, where this sleazy Skakoan used 2 of these transports to haul treasure back to his palace. While we never see the full interior of these models, it could be assumed that the droid racks were removed, giving Tambor even more cargo space for his riches. New model or not, we do get to see a new feature of the MTT, the cargo hatch, where Mace Windu alongside Razor and Stack were hiding. We see that it has more than enough room for the cargo, and maybe Tambor would have gotten away with it if he put a couple droidicas in there as well. As we see, the cross-section also says how it was great for transporting destroyer droids. The history of the MTT is pretty straightforward, having almost nothing before its appearance on the plains of Naboo. The Trade Federation deployed at least 12, which combined could deploy 1,452 droids. Flanked by AATs and STAPs, the MTTs stayed out of the line of fire as the army that they brought to bear had seemingly won the day. That was until a certain chosen one interfered, shutting down the entire droid army. After their debut, we see the MTTs being used throughout the Clone Wars as previously mentioned. But Bactoid also continued to innovate new transports for the CIS. These included the MUT and Trade Federation Troop Transport. Think flying MTT. But ultimately, the multi-troop transport remained the go-to vehicle for most of the war. Other notable times that we see the MTT in use was during the Battle of Kashyyyk, and even the Battle of Coruscant. When unable to use the MTT to deploy troops, the CIS often made use of the HMP droid gunship, to quickly fly in clankers alongside a devastating barrage of suppressive fire, like we saw in Scipio. The influence of the MTT's design was also seen in one of the deadliest creations ever brought out by Bactoid, the Super Tank. Like all things Confederacy, the MTT saw the end of its glory days when Darth Vader ended the Clone Wars on Mustafar. While it has been said that the MTT did see later action in the Galactic Civil War, it did not play a notable role in any key battles. Well, that about wraps it up for the MTT, but you definitely want to stick around for these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. It was originally designed to look like a train, but the final look for the MTT took a cue from nature thanks to Doug Chang, with its tall facade and chin guns made to resemble an African elephant's skull and tusks. And while not much changed regarding the MTT and its switch from Legends to canon, it did receive a bit of meddling. It went from 31 meters long in Legends to 35.6 in canon. Strangely though, it shrunk in height, going from 13 meters tall to just 10.54 meters. Cross-section comes from Star Wars Complete Cross-Sections, and additional information comes from Star Wars Encyclopedia of Starfighters and Other Vehicles, and Ultimate Star Wars. But most important of all, remember that the MTT, an entire army, is just a carry-on, and the Force will be with you, always. When you want the transport capability of an MTT, but you don't need to have enough armor to knock down a building, look no further than the Platoon Attack Craft. What's up, MetaNerds? Today we're going to be taking a look at the Trade Federation's Platoon Attack Craft, otherwise known as the PAC. We'll be using both Legends and canon sources to deliver you a complete picture of the PAC's stats, capabilities, and role in the Trade Federation's forces, from the Battle of Naboo to beyond. The Platoon Attack Craft played an essential role in Trade Federation and later CIS forces, transporting massive quantities of battle droids as a part of a larger combined arms operation. The vehicle, 26 meters in length, was essentially a repulsor lift sled adapted from civilian use, similar to how the Trade Federation adapted the STAP from a civilian airhook. Here we can see the continued trend of the Trade Federation in this early period when they tried to present themselves as a purely commercial enterprise, concealing their considerable warfighting abilities in the development of their combat vehicles. The sled was piloted by a pair of OOM pilot droids, likely replaced during the Clone Wars with independently thinking models. The PAC carried a rack stowing 112 battle droids armed with standard blaster rifles, identical to the rack carried on board its larger brother, the multi-troop transport. The PAC, with its open design, is unarmored and did not have any weaponry, making the troops it carried very vulnerable even to small arms. Thus, the PAC's primary role was shuttling droids around in occupied areas or far behind the battle lines, ideally away from enemy fire. During the occupation of Naboo, they can commonly be seen fulfilling this purpose. Later, we would see them break this rule, with the PACs being used in the direct assault on Republic positions in the amphibious assault on Kachiro Beach, possibly only because the heavy MTTs could not hover across the lake. When the Trade Federation became a part of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, they took their arsenal with them, including their stockpile of PACs. Platoon attack craft were used to shuttle droids from the factories and holding areas to the Petronaki Arena on Geonosis, during what would become the first battle of the Clone Wars, and they were later seen on Hisrich in the aforementioned Kashyyyk. Unlike most donated vehicles, they were not repainted in CIS colors, instead appearing in their standard Trade Federation livery. So without armor and weapons, why would the Trade Federation CIS use the PAC over the much more capable MTT Big Brother? Well, firstly, and never to be underestimated in importance to Neimoidians, is cost.
This is outrageous! I object!
The PAC cost a mere 37,000 credits versus the MTT's 120,000, so it's more than 3 times cheaper. Additionally, the use of less materials freed up additional supplies and factory space, meaning you could pump out these and other craft faster. Secondly, the PAC was a faster vehicle, nearly twice the speed, moving without any of the heavy armor of the MTT at a rate of 50 km per hour at maximum thrust. In a transport role, the PAC was superior to the MTT, moving troops to their destination faster and with equal transport capacity, as long as they did not encounter enemy resistance. The Trade Federation clearly saw them as integral to their combat operations, with their C9979 transports carrying 28 of these vehicles, compared to just 11 MTTs, and with Lucrehulks transporting 1,500 PACs compared to 550 MTTs, almost triple the amount. So with all those advantages, why are they so rarely seen in the Clone Wars? The most important reason of all is their vulnerability. They can't be used in the battle lines like the MTT, like we see on Dathomir during Grievous's invasion. Even on nominally secured planets, their cargo of droids is extremely vulnerable to even attacks from blasters and grenades. Thus, on worlds with significant partisan activity, such as Ryloth and Onderon, it was safer to move droids and cargo within protected MTTs, with thick armor that was virtually impossible for lightly armed rebels to breach. Unless of course they got help from the CIA, Jedi.
I love this!
However, it can be assumed that on secure Separatist worlds, it would have been a common sight to see PACs shuttling around cargo and droids, going in between factories and garrisons. That's just the side of the Clone Wars we don't see too often. And then because the droid army was decommissioned after the Clone Wars, these all would have been rapidly decommissioned vehicles, and it was simple to reconvert them, just take the rack off, and now they're standard civilian cargo sleds. And this would have been a really useful vehicle for any world, being the same length as 2.5 school buses, and although no stats exist on the width or height, we can estimate it to be around 2 meters tall, without the rack, using this B1 pilot droid as a reference. This would make it as tall as a king-size bed and almost as wide as a Wookiee plus a Jawa. Although it looks the same, it is unknown whether the droids would deploy from the racks as with the MTT, with those racks spreading laterally in a sequential fashion, or if they deployed by some other method. And keep in mind that the MTT could swap out its rack to carry 20 B2 super battle droids or 20 droidicas. It's unknown if the PAC had this capability, but I don't see why not. Which is terrifying to think about, a rapid response hover sled full of 20 droidicas. Sadly, there's not too much cool facts or behind the scenes material to discuss with this vehicle. Its first identification was oddly not in a vehicle, but rather a locations sourcebook, with its name emerging in the early drafts of the Phantom Menace. A LEGO set created for the PAC in 2015 carried a paltry 8 droids in comparison to what should be 112, a minifig collector's dream. Maybe an update to this forgotten vehicle will come out soon. If not, we'll all express to Dave Filoni our utmost disappointment. If you made it this far, please hit that like button. Comments, shares, it's all the best way to help me out. Subscribe to bring balance to the algorithm. But most important of all, remember, if your tactical droid commander assigns you to one of these, make sure you get this bottom bunk. It might give you some semblance of protection. And the Force will be with you. Always.
Open fire.
What's up, MetaNerdz? This will be a complete breakdown of the Armored Assault Tank, looking under the armor to see how it all worked, seeing how it evolved over the course of the Clone Wars, as both droids and clone forces learned the strengths and weaknesses of it, how it outlived the CIS, and end on some behind-the-scenes facts, pulling from all these different resources. The story of this tank starts with the Neimoidians and Trade Federation. If you want a full detailed history stretching back to the Old Republic, and seeing how all the political machinations worked, check out the Neimoidian species video. But to summarize, the Republic wanted to expand and incorporate the entire galaxy, but the ones that actually ventured into these dangerous areas were the merchants and traders. They needed to defend themselves, and the arm race between traders and pirates resulted in the Trade Federation having the largest standing army in the galaxy by the late Republic era. Factoid Armor Workshops, led by Wat Tambor and under the parent company of the Techno Union, which itself was a member of the Trade Federation, would produce most of the military equipment for what would later become the CIS. Everything from the E5 blasters, produced by the hundreds of millions, to the B1 and B2 droids themselves. as well as their vehicles from the STAP to MTT and AAT, as well as the larger droids that look like vehicles and ships like the OG-9 and Vulture. The most dangerous areas of the galaxy were in the mid and outer rim, and secretly, Nute Gunray knew that his mysterious Lord Darth Sidious was planning to drag the galaxy into war, and they would use the legitimate threat of pirates and marauders to legally build this military. To defend their on-world factories and worker cities, the AAT, MTT, PAC, and STAP all quickly went from design to rolling out of the factories in a matter of months. At a length of 9.75 meters, a width of 8.1 meters, and a height of 4.32 meters, it was about a Jawa longer than the TX-130 Saber tank, and more than twice as wide and tall. Its most obvious weak stat is how slow it is. This is a tank intended to be supported by swarms of CIS units in the form of clankers on the ground and hive mind droid fighters and bombers overhead. But at 55 km per hour, it is anywhere from 4 to 6 times slower than the Saber tank. And even the ATTE has a whole 5 km per hour on its top speed. But this was nearly twice the speed of the MTT, which it was designed to escort into battle. And the several inches thick Durasteel armor meant it could take direct hits by high energy laser cannons and explosive rounds, while being immune to small arms fire. If you look close, it is reinforced in key areas. It looks to be about a foot thick right near the cannon on the turret, while the front works like a plow to smash through any obstacles it might come across. From labor-striking protesters on some outer rim world, to the thick forest foliage of Kashyyyk, being several feet thick and curving to form what they call the nose ram. While this entire section is rated to take direct rocket launcher strikes. Starting at the very top are the control command receiver antennas, which keep the tank commander in touch with the Neimoidians up in the Lucrehulk, or later with their battlefield general, be they organic or T-series droid. The top hatch splits open in 2 halves, and the tank commander would sit in this low and rather comfy looking seat, using a viewfinder packed full of ballistic and environmental data, displayed in this red coloring with a red colored reticle. This digital camera targeting system is the only way they could see around them, so a rather simple solution is that the commander would simply stand up and calculate targeting data with their droid eyes. And it's the same idea behind this front hatch. So the actual AAT pilot, distinguished by the blue coloring, could stick their head out to navigate the battlefront. Obviously this is less than ideal, but it's good planning ahead to take both advantage of the digital displays so that they are not exposed, but still having this easy to use emergency backup. The other 2 droids are the left and right gunners, with this crew entering via this main hatchway that would drop down. And just in case the main gunner was sniped while raw viewing, one of these gunners could climb up from inside this space without having to exit and expose themselves to fire. And hopefully close that hatch before some clones sunk a 3-pointer with a thermal detonator. The primary laser cannon pivots on this elevator, and the distance to the target is calculated with these rangefinders that are on each of the secondary laser arm cannons, while general battlefront sensors surround the turret in the form of these rounded bulbs that stick out, right above the dedicated motor for rotating the turret itself. This tube section houses a pair of power generators that connect to the 4-chambered multi-reactor power plant below, which is towards the bottom of the tank, which did make it susceptible to mines, but really there was no way around it. A mine was going to ruin their day no matter what system they put down there. And that generator energizes everything in the ship, running incredibly hot, so they added this air cooling intake system up front. But with this much heavier solid plate armor, they needed incredibly powerful repulsor systems, both in the form of this forward disc and about 100 of these smaller repulsor coils. By shifting the amount of energy to these coil arrays across the rear of this shovel, the AAT can steer left and right, or just blast it forward and back. This section also contains the most unique feature, the 6 variable launcher tubes. The standard loadout contained 10 of these bunker buster high explosive shells for taking down buildings or natural fortifications, 18 armor-piercing shells for taking on enemy vehicles, and 50 general-purpose high-energy shells, for use from everything from lighter armored targets to enemy infantry. With all 3 of these munitions passing through this energy cocooning chamber, an advanced tech of this era that we also see in the ATTE, which encases the shell with a layer of high-energy plasma, which both reduced the friction while flying through the air and acted as a sort of shield-piercing technology, with the idea being that the plasma would be absorbed and burn out an enemy plasma shield, allowing the shell to continue on. If this all wasn't impressive enough, the Separatists had a streamlined logistics system built, so that when they fired all their shots, automated systems would quickly remove the entire foot section and attach a fresh, fully loaded bottom half of the AAT, a process that can be done inside of a C-9979 landing craft or up in a Lucrehulk. And for blasting through pirates and later clone troopers, usually the smaller short-range blasters were enough. It also worked as a transport with these handles on the side accommodating 6 B-1s that could hop on and hold on for their 55 km/h drive into the battlefront. For all this tech, the price tag of $75K is incredible, $10K less than the Saber tank, and 3/4 the cost of an ATTE. And with their first showings in test war games on remote planets, then to fighting off local resistance and pirate groups, the Trade Federation knew these things were ready for war. Remember, this army was completely legal. It's just using it as an invasion force that was a problem.
Begin landing our troops.
My lord, is that legal?
I will make it legal.
The column of overwhelming force with hundreds of vehicles and thousands of B-1 battle droids took over Theed and stormed the royal palace in a few hours. Once the Battle of Naboo began, we see the command structure of these larger tank battalions, with a commander overall signaling to the commanders of each individual tank. While this force is impressive, even shooting down the small and quick N1 starfighter, there was a major weak spot that seems to be right around the front opening hatch, where the armor is at its thinnest, still around 6 inches, but less than what we get up top or on that shovel plow. And since it is connected to smaller blasters, perhaps that opening hatch was a weak point, and if so, it's a pretty big design flaw. As these hits are catastrophic, maybe setting off a chain reaction with the payload, when it takes fire from the Flash Speeder's oversized cannon, and Gungan Boombas. On the plains of Naboo, we see another problem as an overzealous tank commander wants to kill Jar Jar and he opens the top to expose the crew, being perhaps the first of what would become countless exploits of this open-top practice. And a problem specific to these first-generation B-1s, since they were slave to the central computer system, the B-1s went out, and the tanks became paperweights. You can actually see them slowly descending as the repulsors disengage. On Christophsis, the AV-7s proved powerful enough to take out the AATs at a great distance, their artillery shells hitting their mark and forcing the tank line to retreat, while later we see that their slow speed was paired with the expanding shield generation, a tactic which nearly won them the day, and surely was used successfully on other battlefronts. Later we see that many commanders were too confident in their ramming ability.
Watch this! You were right. Next time, listen to orders.
From the lack of discipline in the commanders, not understanding the terrain, panicking at the sight of a Jedi and being tricked into firing on each other, one of the first scenes of them being used in the Clone Wars mirrors what Crosshair would say in the months after the war was over.
These tanks all have the same weakness. The droids operating them.
By the way, what he must have hit to set it all ablaze are the main bolt generator, and then chain reaction into these series of laser-charged batteries. These look like shells, but are actually packed full of energy to make a circuit that generates the main laser cannon bolt. In the jungles of Onderon, Ahsoka shares some of the tricks that the Republic had learned over these years, explaining why they need to disable both sections.
You have to take out both chambers, otherwise the tank will remain operational.
While Rex makes it look easy, showing how to use a simple grenade to remove the threat, or if they use an ion grenade, they could add it to their rebel ranks, which is exactly what they tried doing some nights after this training, and luckily Steela knew how to jumpstart it to get everything back online. When they put it to use, we see how it easily overruns bipedal targets, and it is unclear why there is a charging issue.
Fire the gun!
The gun is recharging!
But it could be due to that complete ion attack shutdown. Maybe the battery array had only built up 2 shots worth of charge, and was just close to that third. Steela takes advantage of the open-top system, sniping out commanders, and since so many of them prefer to view the battlefront with their own optic sensors, it makes me think that the camera screens inside were too limited, and their droid AI found that even with this risk, it must have been better overall to not rely on those screens. Over the course of the war, the AAT would inspire the HAGM, the heavy artillery version that was supposed to combine the power of an AV-7 and AAT. And then there was the defoliator deployment tank variant, which was made to support the defoliator weapon. This was much wider and with more support at the rear in order to accommodate that greater top-heavy weight. This weapon proved excellent against fleshy organics and their terrain filled with all sorts of dense plant life. Great thing about droids for troops is that they could operate in a blazing heat, didn't have to worry about breathing in smoke, and of course the weapon itself deprived the locals of a place to hide and set up ambushes, and was used to destroy a population's food supply if they were resistant to Separatist control. Over the course of the war, both sides realized that the ATTE was more powerful and able to adapt to nearly any environment, even capable of vertical ascents of fortress walls and plateaus, and its main gun packed a greater punch than the AAT. Even with the plasma cocooning feature, it is said to be incapable of penetrating deflector shield projectors, while the Republic Walker tank could. And with that weak spot being exploited so often, it ended up being seen much like the droid army. Nothing impressive in of itself, but often effective by the sheer volume of them. Legendary stories of the AAT did not live on long after the war, while there were stories of ATTEs leveling entire mountains, and their insanely creative uses by the clone army. Though during the liberation of Rylaw, they would be used to expertly cut off an ATTE advance, taking out the lead tanks on a narrow mountain pass. It was only for the elite training of the ARF troopers and Master Windu's combat brilliance that used the nimble AT-RTs to evade tank fire, get in close, and ruthlessly exploit weaknesses they had learned, putting a detonator right on top of that laser charge battery, and barraging the power generators on the side. This tank would take part in the near extinction of the Night Sisters, though the locals would overtake one and turn it into a mobile energy bow platform. And AATs were present right up to the final moments of the war, even touching down on Coruscant via the C-9979 landing crafts. Even if Yoda did his part in taking out hundreds of them, perhaps even thousands that we just don't see, since each of these landing craft carries 114 of these tanks, tilted back to stack better, moving into position via these conveyor belts, and then descending down the main ramp. Even after the Separatist defeat, they weren't all destroyed. Many of them were up-armored by the Empire to take the form of the Imperial assault tank. While it isn't confirmed that there's an AAT under there, it just makes sense that the Imps would put this thing to use instead of scrapping thousands of them that were still in perfect condition. And if you look close, everything is in the right spot, even the guns, so I think it's safe to say that they simply built up on the AAT. And the scenario we saw on Desix must have played out on hundreds of worlds across the galaxy, as countless local warlords would have popped up in the uneasy peace following the abrupt ending to the Clone Wars. Some would fight for stability, while others were just thugs and pirates that were eager to get their hands on military-grade tech. These months and even some years into the Empire, AATs were still slugging it out on every terrain you could imagine, which is a testament to their reliability and/or ease at repairing, as even up to 20 years after the droid shutdown and slaughter of the CIS leadership, there were many AATs painted in rebel colors floating across the battlefront. So that's it for the breakdown. As for behind-the-scenes facts, this function isn't mentioned in any of the source books, but there's this great recoil reduction feature with the barrel, something like a reciprocating recoil system. The AAT was actually thought up for the original rough draft of The Star Wars. It was going to show the Imp's presence on-world, and while it was scrapped when they were finally planning the invasion of Theed for the Phantom Menace, it morphed into the AAC, or Armored Attack Craft, and was going to look like an assault helicopter. In Battlefront, there were going to be AATs in the Imperial faction as well, and some modders have found this original source code that was abandoned. If you want to read up more on this tank yourself, pick up the Cross Sections book and Essential Guide to Warfare. Likes, comments, and shares are the best way to help me out. Subscribe if you want to see more, and check out the membership. But most important of all, remember, it doesn't matter how thick your armor is, if your enemy has plot-based weaponry. And the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? Today we'll be taking a deep dive into one of the most intimidating droids to march into battle, the Octuptarra combat droid, as well as the variants of similar names. We'll break down the differences between these machines, how versatile they were for the Separatists, and of course some interesting behind-the-scenes facts to wrap things up. Designed and manufactured by the Skakoans of the Techno Union, and named after the living creature, the Octuptarra, back on their world of Skako.
The Techno Union Army is at your disposal, Count.
This droid had two main variants that we need to address before moving forward with the breakdown. The standard size is known as the Combat Tri-Droid, and the larger size, like the ones we see on Megiddo and Christophsis, are called the Magna Tri-Droid. So to preempt any confusion, I'll address each of these droids by their combat or Magna distinction when going over their stats and history. With that out of the way, let's take a closer look at the Tri-Droid, starting with the Combat variant. Standing at a height of 3.6 meters, or 11 feet 10 inches, the Combat Tri-Droid was still a rather imposing foe to face, backing up the B-1s and B-2s. It's about a foot taller than your standard school bus, and just under the height of two clone troopers, who stand at an even 6 foot. However, it isn't made clear if this is the default height when its legs are in a crouched position as seen in these images, or if that is the tallest it could get. Based on the brief scenes from the movie though, I'd wager my last credit that it's the former, with the Combat Tri-Droid actually being capable of a slightly greater stature. This terrifying tripod was classified as a 4th degree droid, meaning it was built for military and security purposes, as opposed to say a certain R2 unit who wasn't purely bred for battle, he just took a liking to it. The Combat Tri-Droids had red sensors and were armed with 3 laser cannons, but there was yet another variant that added even more of a threat than these massive turrets. The ever-cruel Skakoans filled the head of this droid with a plague virus during the Battle of Uba 4, which would be released into the air upon the droid's destruction, giving these horrors the nickname of the Virus Droid. During the Battle of Coruscant, we see these droids with another ordnance variation, not firing blaster bolts, but instead a single deadly beam, similar to that of Bactoid's homing spider droid. After firing any of these weapons, and this applies to the larger variant as well, the droid's bulbous cranium would rotate, allowing for a new forward-facing gun to unleash a volley at whatever poor soldiers were in this beast's warpath. This made the Tri-Droid very difficult to fight, as it had no true front or back, and all sides were defended at all times. We don't have any further information on this droid's speed, weight, or cost, all still corporate secrets of the Techno-Union. What we do know, however, is that the smaller combat Tri-Droid was the first of many models they built, with the larger Magna Tri-Droid following soon after. Sadly, that's about it for the little brother, so let's look to the towering Magna in all its spindly glory. The Octuptarra Magna Tri-Droid was a behemoth, standing at a height of 14.59 meters or 49 feet. That's 4 feet taller than the letters on the Hollywood sign, if it came here to liberate Earth. Although this model was the second of the two from its use in the Clone Wars, it appears to be the more popular variant. Maybe it was the imposing size that sold the Seps on its 100,000 credit price tag, which is the cost of 2.5 Vulture droids, or 1/3 the cost of an ATTE, while having a top speed of 50 kilometers per hour or 31 miles per hour. About 10 kilometers per hour slower than the Republic's main walker. But the Magna can do something the ATTE never dreamed of. When it comes to firepower, it not only has the standard, albeit larger laser cannon turrets, it can also be fitted with deadly heavy ordnance launchers. One missile was enough to not only destroy a UT-AT, but flip it over into the air several meters before the massive, heavy tank came crashing down. And it hurts to think what that kind of concussive force would do to a poor shiny who just transferred to the outer rim. The ammunition was stored in the head of the walker, with a total of 48 shells to dish out destruction. In theory, 48 major pieces of armor could be destroyed by a single Magna Tri-Droid, all for just 100,000 credits. Even though these 3 cannons were its only pure weapons, its size could also be used for attack. With massive claws on the ends of its long legs, and the sheer weight of the machine at work allowed the Magna to stomp and crush through enemies as well. This size did have its downsides though, for if small groups of well-trained infantry could get close enough, the walker did not have any sort of defense against this kind of attack. This weakness is demonstrated a few times by a certain chosen one in his elite 501st. So it was best to use these massive mechs in tandem with other tanks and infantry to support it. But what if all is lost, armor is destroyed, and all of your battle droid support is cut to scrap by those pesky Jedi? Fear not, because the Magna Tri-Droid has a few surprises left in him. First, and it is safe to assume the smaller model could do this as well, the droid could use its claws to climb sheer walls, like we see on Christophsis. Presumably it could do this to cliffs as well, or really just about any surface, making it a viable option for dramatic escapes or even very creative attacks, stomping all over everything from subterranean bases to spaceports and floating cities like Bespin. But if climbing isn't your style, don't worry, the Skakoans have a plan B, as seen on yet another potential variant of the Tri-Droid. As we see during the daring escape of Echo on Skako Minor, the Techno-Union implemented a new design for their famed Tri-Droid, that being a massive thruster that could propel this terror into the sky and fly in and out of combat. As if the Magna Tri-Droid wasn't scary enough, apparently they fly now.
They fly now! He forgot. But what if that was the first time they used them? They've been using them since the Clone Wars.
Sorry, I had to. A self-propelled, computer-automated mobile artillery unit capable of destroying heavy Republic tanks in a single shot, now soaring through the air. All I can say is luckily the Clone Wars was rigged, because the CIS had some very disturbing toys. With the stats and variants done, let's talk history. Like I said, the smaller combat droid was one of the first out of the factory, followed by the larger Magna. It isn't exactly known when in the timeline this variant came out, just that it was implemented into battle by Worm Loathsome in 22 BBY, just months after the Battle of Geonosis. It was during the Battle of Christophsis that we see both the pros and cons of this walker, with it being able to deal out incredible amounts of damage on the battlefront, but is very susceptible to attacks from the more creative forces of the Republic. Here's where we saw the climbing abilities of this droid, with Asajj Ventress attempting to escape from the Jedi using a hidden Tri-Droid that was clung to the side of the building. This would not work in her favor, as she got caught monologuing instead of making her retreat, and Anakin, alongside Obi-Wan, leapt onto the stilt-like legs of this machine and cut through them. A major weakness when all of the generals of your enemy's army are wielding these devices that slice through legs like butter. And of course, it sent this titanic droid falling to the ground below. We don't see them pop up again for some time, with the next appearance coming during Anakin and Rex's rescue of the ARC Trooper Echo from the clutches of Wat Tambor and Skako Minor. This flying variant is painted in crisp Techno-Union colors and soaring along D1 aerial battle droids, which were the perfect complement, something that really would have helped out on Christophsis. But along with Clone Force 99, he was still able to take it down just like before. Although the clones and Jedi escape, we don't see another variant of the Tri-Droid until the very end of the Clone War, though that doesn't mean they weren't used across the galaxy. We see these droids swarming the streets of Coruscant during the abduction of the Senate, these being the smaller combat ones, which are also seen taking on the 212th during the Battle of Utapau. The large Magna Tri-Droid is seen one last time during Order 66 on Megiddo, flipping that hover tank, right before Bakara and his Marines got the call that took down Master Mundi. Following the rise of the Empire and the slaughter of the Separatist Council at the hands of Lord Vader, almost all Tri-Droids, Magna and Combat alike, were deactivated and scrapped. I say almost because the Legends has it that many remained active on Uba 4 as planetary security. No further use of this droid was documented, as with many of the CIS war machines. Being controlled by a droid brain as opposed to a pilot oftentimes made it more trouble than it was worth for the Alliance to restore them, if they could find any at all. And clearly Palpatine wanted to go in a different direction. An undignified end to such a cool piece of tech. That closes the holocron on the Octuptarra Tri-Droid, but let's look at some behind the scenes facts. Its first appearance was in Chapter 23 of the original Clone Wars show, and then of course in Revenge of the Sith, the Clone Wars, as well as some books and games like Republic Heroes. LEGO included the combat variant in its Utapau battle pack as cannon fodder for the clones, and Hasbro has also gotten in on the action with both the smaller variant and, more impressively, the large Magna Tri-Droid from the Clone Wars, being a Walmart exclusive at the time. The Octuptarra was designed by Ryan Church for Revenge of the Sith, and was one of the few vehicles seen throughout Star Wars media that has a plethora of color variants, at least 5 seen across different shows and films. If you want more, be sure to check out these resources, but that does it for the Octuptarra Tri-Droid. Please hit that like button, share the video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Those are all the best ways to help me out. And check out one of these videos, I'm sure you'll like them. But most important of all, remember, if you start smelling that spicy air of a cracked Octuptarra, tell your batch brothers you love them, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is all about the vehicle that cut down rows of clone infantry, the OG-9 homing spider droid. Unlike the HMP droid gunship, this walker did not have any personality matrix, long-term memory modules, or a vocoder to communicate with the world around it. So although I made the argument that the gunship may have had some sort of sentience, I think we need to view the OG-9 as a conventional mindless droid. Just a 4-legged tool for dealing death, and actually for collecting debts. The OG-9 was commissioned by the Commerce Guild for the purpose of convincing debtors to give over their delinquent credits. But it was designed and manufactured by Bactroid Armor Workshop, the Geonosians that produced most of the droid army. After the snafu on Naboo, the Republic tried to break up some of the Trade Federation's weapons facilities, including the providers of tanks and B-1s over at Bactoid. Before they were destroyed, these homing spiders were bought up by the Commerce Guild, along with the DS-D1 Dwarf Spider. At a cost of only 70,000 credits, you get a whole lot of firepower and features. Its main weapon was the homing laser that could sweep through the battlefront. Notice that this laser doesn't just burn through things, but contains so much power that it actually creates a decent-sized explosion on impact. That bottom laser is the anti-personnel cannon, firing volleys of plasma bolts that can melt through their fleshy foes. It's also reported to have a retractable ion cannon, but this is never seen. It is often compared to the Republic's ATTE in the fact that it is a walker that can move a large gun around the battlefront and that it can take on difficult terrain. The main ball is connected to the forelegs via these long reinforced hydraulic struts, giving the walker a wide and sturdy stance. Then each of these legs also had shock absorbers and adjustable foot pads so that each could adapt independently to climb steep and uneven ground. Really innovative design made sure that its internal components were completely sealed off, so that the OG-9 could walk along the seafloor. And whether submerged thousands of feet underwater, deep in a cavern, or on a mountaintop, this communication receiver made sure that it could still receive orders from the control computer. Remember, these are very simple droids, without a complex AI, so almost everything had to be directly sent out from Lucrehulks and core ships. It did have automated targeting, firing, and reactions to terrain, but it is interesting to keep in mind that these were always being told directly where to go on the battlefront. Kind of like a midpoint between our current remote-operated drones and fully autonomous units like commando droids. Other cool features is that it supposedly could be outfitted with different weaponry, and the hydraulics could let it bring those legs in and stand up tall, cutting down ships with that laser, or whipping out its concealed ion cannon. But again, that has never been depicted, although it would be pretty amazing to see. Its normal standing height is 7.2 meters or 24 feet, making it taller than an AAT, but shorter than a Hailfire. This height was crucial so that it could stand above and fire over most other CIS droids during an attack. Because, just standing next to each other in loose formations, all firing in the same direction, is a quick way to increase friendly fire. The only flaw is that although the encasing of the core was built with thick durasteel, there is a weak point at the connection of these two hemispheres. If directly hit on this area, the top would pop right off as the generators and gas required for these powerful lasers set off a chain reaction. But how was it used during the Clone Wars? Well, 7,500 of them were present during the opening, doing what it was told to and just marching towards the Republic forces while unleashing its weapons. You can see that it had really good range, and the whole plan to fire over CIS assets worked very well as the battle droids charged the clone troopers. Here we see the DS-D1 rushing ahead of its OG-9 brother. Now I mentioned that they were built and sold alongside each other, making for some very cool pairings on the battlefront. These spiders earned a terrifying reputation throughout the Clone Wars due to the burrowing abilities of the DS-D1. This small spider was used by the Commerce Guild to break up mining strikers and pirates that held themselves up deep in their mining tunnels. This ability was also great for raiding anti-CIS populations and Republic outposts. When the DS-D1 found an enemy, it would report back to its big brother, who would lumber its way over to finish him off. Its 90 km/h or 56 mph top speed meant that it may take some time to get there, but whenever you saw the little spider pop up, you knew that it was only a matter of time before you and your allies were being cut down by its laser scythe. Some OG-9s were present during the Battle of Mimban, killing a Jedi Master, and one nobly tried to bring balance to the Force by opening fire on Jar Jar Binks. Later, they would be seen on Felucia, moments before Aayla Secura was killed via Order 66. Because they rely so heavily on direct control from CIS personnel, it is less likely that any survived the decommission of CIS droids after the end of the Clone Wars. And sadly, there are no reports of them being used by rebels or any pirate factions. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Something that always confused me and was one of my few disappointments in the Clone Wars TV show is that there are no OG-9s or Hailfires, two of my favorite vehicles. I wanted to point out that there were some inconsistencies with the guidebooks that say that the top weapon is the anti-personnel cannon and the bottom is the homing laser. I debated if I should change this for the video, as I could make an argument for why it's called that, but it just seems like pointless complication and probably a result of a mistake on their part. It is known for its main laser beam that is fired on top, and it doesn't make sense that the shooting gun isn't the cannon and that the beam weapon isn't the laser. I think it's gotta be the other way around, so that's how I presented it earlier, despite the guidebooks. And I wanted to point out interesting things that both Battlefronts did right. The original shows how good it is against infantry, but takes forever against an ATTE, which probably wouldn't take that long, but definitely makes the point of how specialized the droid army was. Let the OG-9 focus on troops, let the Hailfire focus on vehicles. The new Battlefront has a more boring, if also somewhat accurate use of the OG-9. They wouldn't be piloted by other droids, and I hear that it works as just a giant turret while the Republics attack a core ship. And remember, they didn't have an AI, so you can see how a command to just have them line up as turrets actually makes a lot of sense. Additional information was gained via the Star Wars New Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, On the Frontline, Essential Guide to Warfare, Ultimate Star Wars, and the Complete Encyclopedia. But most important of all, remember, always shoot over friendlies, not in between them, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? In today's video, we're going to be talking about the DS-D1 Dwarf Spider Droid. We'll do a full breakdown of its terrifying ability, see why those in the mining profession worried that this thing would pop up out of the ground and kill them, learn how it worked and the many ways that it was used by the CIS during the Clone Wars, as well as look at some variants and behind-the-scenes facts. The Dwarf Spider Droid was built by Baktoid Armor Workshop, the same people that would produce the majority of the weapons, vehicles, and droids of the CIS. It would stand at a height of 1.98 meters or 6.5 feet tall, not including this large antenna, being only a few centimeters taller than a B1 battle droid. At a width of 3.05 meters or 10 feet, it was about 1.5 B1 battle droids across. And with a mass of 337 kilograms, it weighed more than 5 B1s. If it showed up here on Earth, it would be just taller than an F-150 truck, wider than a school bus, and weighed nearly as much as 2,000 Goliath bird eater spiders. The Dwarf Spider Droid consists of a turret-like head with multiple infrared photoreceptors and scanners. Things like the ARC Trooper's Stealth Walker might have been able to cloak their EM signature and invade these infrared scanners, but the droid also has a pair of echolocation emitters. Sound wave data cross-referenced with the IR data might have been able to detect any anomalies via cloaking or jamming tech. The DSD-1 was colloquially known as the burrowing spider droid, because of its terrifying ability to dig after its opponents. More on how that was used to break up the mining guild strikers in a bit. The droid used 4 spider-like legs for locomotion. These legs would help in movement and provide a stable platform when aiming, and even allowed it to scale some steep terrain. The Dwarf spider droids would have masculine programming, but it wouldn't communicate via galactic basic, instead using a sort of binary, speaking via a series of beeps, not actual words like we hear with some battle droids and even stuff like the HMP droid gunship. The main armament of the Dwarf spider droid would be a single heavy blaster cannon. This gun would be versatile and work against a variety of targets. Its anti-personnel firing mode would easily take out clones or enemies from afar. Its secondary firing mode would be much slower but more powerful, easily blowing through light vehicles like the ATRT, though it did only put dents in larger Republic vehicles like the ATTE. But it would even be able to shoot down aircraft. By dropping those back legs and giving it enough of a firing arc, we see that it had enough elevation to hit stuff like the clone gunship used by Rex, Cody, and Bad Batch on an axis. The rotation speed of the head was rather slow, and so it wouldn't be able to fight faster targets. Another flaw was that the length of the blaster cannon barrel would sometimes prevent it from turning or even maneuvering in tight spaces. The underside of the DSD was also a weak spot for explosives, but as a final attack it could initiate self-destruct, causing its generator to violently explode, vaporizing the DSD and anyone unfortunate enough to be around it when it happened. Though sometimes this could happen from incoming attacks, which would also set off the generator and sometimes damage nearby CIS assets. Though as Wrecker shows us, if you can also block the barrel right as it fires, the attack will destroy itself without initiating the self-destruct feature. And the vibro knife carried by Hunter seems to discharge some disabling electric energy, so when stabbed through the photoreceptor, it would travel to the droid brain and shut it down. As for its history, it is actually quite the Outer Rim corporate dystopian nightmare. The DSD-1 would first be operated by the Commerce Guild in the years before the outbreak of the Clone Wars. Commerce Guild would operate many mining operations across the galaxy, and on several occasions, these miners would try to revolt. To counter this, the Commerce Guild would deploy the DSDs to enter the mines and convince everyone to get back to work. After this, it would be used in conjunction with its big brother, the OG-9 spider droid, to pay a visit to those who were trying to evade paying the Commerce Guild. Right before the outbreak of the Clone Wars, Commerce Guild would join the Confederacy of Independent Systems and provide it with their battle droids and vehicles, with these 2 spider droids being a main addition to the CIS vast droid collection. The DSD would first see operations during the very outbreak of the Clone Wars and the earliest moments of the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY. Before the Colosseum and the main battle erupted, several DSDs were protecting multiple anti-orbital guns surrounding the Geonosian arena, and these large guns would protect the planet from capital ships in orbit. These guns and the spider droids defending them would be destroyed by Mace Windu and Luminara Unduli, with the assistance of some TX-130 saber tanks. Now that the clones and the rest of the Jedi could arrive on the planet, the DSDs would soon face the Republic in full force. On Geonosis, the DSDs proved their worth and were able to pick up clone troopers from many kilometers. Not only were they killing clones, but they were also helpful in pinpointing specific targets. The big antenna was relaying enemy positions and data back to command, and they would help their big brothers the OG-9s in a specific tactic. The DSDs would race out and scout ahead, but as soon as a bigger threat or overwhelming force would appear, calling in the OG-9 with its laser that could just cut through ranks of troopers, and the big gun that could punch holes in things like the ATT. After Geonosis, the DSD would be operating on numerous Separatist-controlled worlds for a variety of different purposes. In most cases, they were on the front lines with many other battle droids used by the CIS. It would be present at major battles such as Christophsis, Malastare, and many others. On Malastare, the DSDs would be lethal to the Dug mounted troops, wiping out all but one of them before they could reach the droids, only to be shot dead as he attempted to destroy them up close and personal. And in Legends, we know of their use on Munificent, Dantooine, and Thule, just to name a few. And the Separatists would also use the DSDs on defense. On Teth, they were stationed here to defend against the ATTEs on an almost vertical cliff. Having the high ground, the spiders had an incredible advantage, and could fire on the ATTEs' feet, disabling their legs and causing them to fall to their doom. Another time we see them defending the Separatist prison complex, the Citadel, on the planet Lola Seyu. But the commander of the base, the OC Sobek, seems to prefer the similar LM-432 crab droid over the dwarf spider droid, as we only see 2 DSDs way off in the background, compared to the dozens, if not hundreds of crab droids used on this base. Quite the opposite can be said for the Separatist base on Felucia, where a ton of DSDs are stationed to defend this base, as well as patrolling the surrounding forests. And it would also return to its roots as an anti-riot unit in service with the CIS on Reluctant Worlds. Onderon was one such world, but the Onderon rebels were able to use guerrilla warfare style tactics, and were able to best many of the dwarf spiders. Throughout the war, several variants of the DSD would be made. The first is the amphibious version developed for the swamplands, marshes, and other wet environments, and could actually operate underwater. This type's blaster cannon seems to be bigger than the normal version, although whether if this is because it is a stronger gun or just something to do with it being able to operate underwater is unknown. This type was used during the later stages of the Battle of Kashyyyk against the Republic and the native Wookiees. These last two variants are now legends, but they are some of the coolest ones. There was the heavy Dwarf Spider Droid, which now had 3 of those heavy blaster cannons. It also had some sort of apparatus on its back, which we don't know exactly what it was, but it was most likely some sort of upgraded power generator to support the additional firepower. This type saw use at the Battle of Geonosis, where it was extremely effective against infantry. The last type was the Advanced Dwarf Spider Droid, or ADSD. This type was heavily redesigned and included many more enhancements. Additional armor plating on its legs, a top-mounted turret with explosive blaster rounds, and an ability to fight in complete darkness, along with linked missile launchers made this a much deadlier version over your standard DSD. The Clone Commando Delta Squad would face this type on numerous occasions, and Captain Rex even faced one of these as well. And believe it or not, the ADSD was actually available before the Clone Wars, where it was also used in the same anti-riot duty, but of course more reserved when those rioters acquired some heavy ordnance. When the time came to join the CIS, the ADSD was also added, but sparingly due to its high costs. When the time came for the Clone Wars to end with the execution of Order 66, all of the droids used by the CIS would be ordered to shut down. This is true in canon at least, but the DSD has a special story in Legends. Initially, they were shut down like the rest, but a few years into the Imperial era, the Empire began recommissioning the DSDs into Imperial service, and they were first put to use against their former masters, with the Imperials sicking them on newly captured Separatist worlds. While other DSDs were sent to many training centers across the galaxy, allowing many stormtroopers to train against this Clone Wars terror, while others almost became a sort of Imperial attack dog, where they would be used in stormtrooper squads to be sent in against rebels that were held up in a building or cave system, or would be alongside them when out on patrol. So that's it for its history and breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Dwarf Spider Droid is created for Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Originally, all of the different Separatist groups were just going to be painted the same B1 battle droid color, but this was later changed to make the droid army more unique, with each faction having this assemblage of different droids. The Advanced Dwarf Spider Droid was created for the Republic Commando video game, and the Heavy DSD was created for the Clone Campaign's expansion pack for Star Wars Battlegrounds. Additional information comes from the visual dictionaries, complete locations, essential guide to droids, encyclopedias of starfighters and other vehicles, and Ultimate Star Wars. But most important of all, remember, if your Union rep doesn't have a plan for killing the burrowing spider robot that shoots lasers out of its face and calls for an even bigger spider friend, then just get another job. And the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is all about the NR-N99 Persuader class, aka the Snail tank. In other videos, we saw how the OG-9 and the Hailfire were used to collect debts. If you owed credits to the Commerce Guild, you'd wake up to a towering, mechanized spider laser cutting the roof off of your home. If the Munes recalled your loan, you'd be trying to outrun the Hailfire and its 30 rocket payload. But if you crossed the corporate alliance, it was the Snail tank that you had to worry about. The CA didn't deal too much with personal loans, so they weren't really trying to repossess loaned property, but rather protect their property. Some loved the CA for their ability to civilize remote worlds and bring trade and jobs to these areas, but others had problems with how certain corporations in the alliance conducted business. Protesters would often block access to these controversial manufacturers, or even destroy property, which is what caused the CA to look to the Techno Union for a solution. They were able to produce a cheap, powerful, and speedy droid unit to bust up the dissenters. Each unit cost the CA only 49,000 credits. That's less than the cost of the disposable TIE fighter, and even less than the solutions used by the IBC and the Commerce Guild. For that price, you got a lot of firepower, with 2 ion cannons and 2 heavy repeating blasters, but a modular design allowed it to be swapped out for shock rifles or a series of heavy explosives. I like that with the Hailfire we saw that it had a shock option as well, belying the fact that even in the Outer Rim, you can't just go around killing anything that gets in your way. Or at least not for long. But when you were certain that death and destruction were warranted, you could swap these cannons out for 2 variable munition launch tubes, capable of firing either 12 concussion missiles, 48 thermal detonators, 4 homing missiles, or 4 dumbfire torpedoes. I think the great variation in weaponry here shows the great variation in the groups that oppose the CA. Some would have just been peaceful protesters getting stunned to regain access to the property, but others would have been dedicated militants. We see some of this with groups like the Nebula Front, a sort of monopoly-busting militia that waged war on the Trade Federation using starfighters, blasters, and bombs. So it is reasonable to think that the CA faced similar folks on the worlds that they operated on. In a way, these droids were battle-hardened by the time that the Clone Wars broke out. When the CA allied itself with the CIS, they donated most of their Snail tanks to the war effort, where its design features were able to really shine. The vehicle is essentially a droid brain and munitions wrapped up in a tread system. This main unit here houses everything, with these photoreceptor eye stalks and communications antenna attaching to its droid brain. It actually has a more complex AI than the OG9 and Hailfire, being able to calculate where to travel and what to destroy in order to accomplish the mission, whereas those other guys just react to things like terrain data while moving along pre-assigned routes. But if any corrections had to be made, the pilot droids located in core ships could always log in and take control of it. This main unit would contain all of the engines that kept everything moving, and the Tabana gas used for its weaponry. By having these pair of side treads out on pylons, it made the tank a lot more stable, but also ensures a good grip when traveling across the debris-filled battlefront. With a height of 6.2 meters or 20 feet, it was about 2/3 the height of the AT-ST. And with a length of 10.96 meters or 36 feet, the Snail is about a Jawa longer than an AAT. But despite this size and use of treads instead of repulsors, it still gets up to a great top speed. Standard models have a top speed of 60 km per hour or 37 miles per hour, but some variants can reach 100 km per hour or 62 miles per hour. This made even the base faster than the AAT, and the variant is quicker than even the AT-RT. But the way the Snail tank combines these traits is kinda terrifying. When this thing was deployed, it would often crash right through buildings to get to its targets. Hitting walls at 60 miles per hour would smash them to pieces, and the incredible grab of those treads meant that it wouldn't even slow down as it accelerated over the resulting rubble. Its eye stalks and a name like Snail Tank might not be that intimidating, but if you understand this thing's ability, you'll think twice about opposing the Corporate Alliance and the CIS. But oppose the Republic did, and over the course of the Clone Wars, they could be seen on various worlds. On Christophsis, they were taken out on the bridge by AV-7 artillery. Later, they were a part of an invasion force on Malastare, and would have their droid brains fried by the electro-proton bomb. Then they were found on Megiddo, and most notably on Kashyyyk. Here they unveiled some cool abilities, but also a crucial weakness. You could see that droid units could ride on the side tracks, and impressively that with fast enough speeds, they could ride on top of the water. Where the DS-D1 Dwarf Spider was crawling up along the seafloor, the larger NR-99 was riding the waves. But the Wookiees were able to blow apart one by attaching a single thermal detonator. This housed all that Tabana gas and its droid brain, so this chain reaction instantly turned it into a pile of scrap. After the Clone Wars ended, some Wookiees repurposed Hailfires to use against the Empire, but it's unclear if any Snail tanks were used this way. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. This thing was set to appear in episode 2, and there are even animatics that depict it, but they weren't finished in time for the deadline. And there is some confusion as to whether OOM pilots can control it remotely or have to actually sit inside. The Wikipedia and some other sources imply that in episode 3, an OOM was shown inside of one, but I think that is just a confusion of what's happening in this scene. You can see the OOM seeming to fly out from inside of the tank, but if you go back and just slow it down, you can see the OOM standing on the side. So I think this is who we see getting blown towards the top of the screen. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Additional information comes from the Star Wars Encyclopedia of Starfighters and Other Vehicles, Ultimate Star Wars, and the Complete Visual Dictionary. So that's it for the NR-99 Snail Tank. But most important of all, remember, beware the bulldozing snails, and the Force will be with you, always.
A spider droid, look out! Delta, pay attention. You may only have one shot at this. You're looking at a Dwarf spider droid, one of the Commerce Guild's nastiest anti-infantry units.
What's up, MetaNerdz? This video will break down two of the Dwarf Spider descendants, the ADSD and HDSD. Check out the whole video on the DSD-1, but to sum up its history, it was made by Bactoid Armor Workshop, stood 2 meters tall, just a bit taller than your average humanoid, and focused all of its power into moving these 4 legs that could scurry over any terrain or walk straight up walls. pick up on any target with its infrared photoreceptors and scanners that could see through solid stone and pierce through the darkest caverns. Which came in handy since it was commissioned to hunt down striking worker groups that held up in narrow mine shafts. Like most of the vehicles that would end up being used in warfare on the side of the CIS, they were originally used as lone collection and union breaking droids, which is true of everything from the Hailfire to the Spider droid family. The DSD-1 could self-destruct if it was being overwhelmed, and simply close off the mineshaft to let the revolutionaries die, just from running out of air or other resources, while sending everything it did and saw back to a sort of squad commander that was the OG-9. To fill in the gap between these two creepy crawlies, Backtoward Armor Workshop produced the Heavy as a direct successor to the DSD-1. And through the complicated web of ownership by these companies that were large militaries, the Commerce Guild would buy up most of these heavy units, and then later donate their use to the joint CIS effort right before the Battle of Geonosis. They would see combat during the opening battle of the Clone Wars, and the thicker metal composite used in their body would make it harder to destroy, while it upped the main cannon from the single weapon to now 3 heavy blaster cannons, each much stronger than the cannons that would end up on the AT-ST, but still less than the chin-mounted heavy laser cannons of the AT-AT. They would most often be deployed in squads of 4, but could be sent out in pairs or up to 5 Spider comrades under a OG-9. And together they could concentrate their fire and easily take out row after row of charging clone troopers, and even melt their way through the thick armor plating of ATTEs, and were accurate enough to simply target weaker systems like the cockpit or accordion section to leave it dead in the water, and clean up the crew that was desperately trying to escape. We don't know the cost of the DSD-1 or the Heavy variant, but since the ADSD successor that would become the ultimate unit in the line was only $25K, I can't see how it would cost more than that. I wouldn't be surprised if it was as little as half that. So you can see another example of just how much more cost-effective the CIS military was. If we say $15K for the Heavy, for the cost of a single ATTE, you can pump out 20 Heavies or 12 of the Advanced. And that doesn't even account for the cost of creating the clones to operate the clone tank walker, nor the overall greater cost to maintain organics. None of the parts used to create these droid spiders were specialized, and their main weapon relied on blaster tech, using the ubiquitous Tabana gas to power it, not any specialized projectiles or explosive warheads. Though of course, to be fair, these tanks do play a different role in the battlefield. The main show on the ATTE is the mass projectile launcher, and putting these weapons on LA-ATs as well showed a different theory in warfare on the Republic side, with each unit from the clones themselves to their vehicles being far more expensive, but qualitatively more powerful. There are certain things these spiders simply cannot destroy no matter how concentrated their fire was. Before we turn to the advanced Dwarf Spider droid, now we get to the advanced variant, the most like a proper tank in this line, though you'll see why it does fall short of what you might expect from Republic tank standards or even the AAT. It too is spread all throughout the galaxy before the outbreak of the Clone Wars, though was not said to be produced by Backtoward, but rather the Commerce Guild manufacturers. Like the others, it was designed to root out miners who refused to pay the trade conglomerate's tariffs. It was available commercially for many years before the Battle of Geonosis, and so was used in holographic training simulators for clone troopers on Kamino. However, it was not produced in large numbers until after the mobilization of the droid armies due to cost overruns, which is hilarious and shows that even with its low cost, the shrewd businessmen turned secessionist war strategists saw a $25K price tag as too high, pointing to how much cheaper the other spiders must be, and just how many units were produced in a run that when multiplied by the thousands or millions, each unit being 10K more really did start to add up. Designed for fierce combat on rugged terrain, the ADSD was equipped with a variety of advanced weapon systems. Among its arsenal were dual target-seeking missiles that could launch as soon as the targeting system locked on. Its front legs were armored with large plates, offering substantial protection against frontal attacks.
Its durasteel plating is rated for starship hulls and is nearly invulnerable to small arms fire.
But with some accurate small arms fire, these could be easily blown off. Atop the droid's frame was a powerful cannon that fired high-energy bolts, capable of explosive impact and extensive destruction. And like the others, it is officially rated as a heavy blaster cannon. But the biggest divergence is the fire-linked missile launchers, having a pair of launchers with 36 missiles on board, though these were nowhere near as powerful as the ATTE or even the AAT, which did have proper anti-armor warheads, much more like an actual tank, whereas these 36 missiles on board were described as frag missiles, meant for taking out infantry. And even if swapped out, this weapon system was more like a shoulder-fired rocket, meant for taking out lighter armor and maybe disabling a tank, but never enough to punch straight through it. However, the unit had a notable vulnerability, its singular red optical cluster. Although it could scan its surroundings for enemies, this cluster remained a weak point, retaining the biggest weakness in the original Dwarf Spider droid.
Only its optical cluster, the red orb on its abdomen, is unshielded and vulnerable. In other words, shoot the big red spot.
Republic forces knew that anti-armor weaponry was particularly effective against these units, and Sev compared the ADSD to being as slow as a Gungan tree sloth.
Slower than a Gungan tree sloth.
Delta Squad encountered numerous war droids during their covert missions throughout the Clone Wars, most notably on Geonosis and Kashyyyk. After Darth Sidious's new apprentice, Darth Vader, executed the Separatist Council, these units, like all the other droids, were deactivated. But sadly, unlike many of the other droid units, from B1s to Vultures, we have no recorded use of the old spiders by rebels or other forces in the following decades. But they would not be forgotten. Being dreamt up in the minds of massive corporate conglomerates trying to silence worker movements and seize assets, brought to life by the bug brains on Geonosis, they would strike terror into clone and civilians alike, as all these variants swarmed their opponents across countless worlds, reporting everything back to their big brother the OG-9 that could blow open areas to let the spiders rush in, or take out larger armor that their heavy blaster cannons couldn't handle. But together, from the single cannon with variable power, to the triple, and then the cannon missile combo, they left their legacy in the chronicles of military history in the galaxy far, far away. That's it for the breakdown. As for behind the scenes facts, the heavy comes from Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds clone campaigns. And although this is only shown in the Clone Wars campaign guide, this is Rex fighting in Advanced, but we don't get any details on when or where this was. Well, of course it comes from the Republic Commando game, and more details come from the Hard Contact novel, as well as the Prima guide. Hit the like button, it's the best way to help me out. Subscribe to see more, and check out these videos, I'm sure you'll like them. But most important of all, remember, if you sign on the dotted line, the spiders will hunt you down in the mines, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This complete breakdown of the Crab Droid, or the LM-432, will pull from every resource available to understand its backstory, how it worked, its history, and behind-the-scenes facts. The CIS is easily the military with the most diverse units in history, from the many varieties of troopers, dozens in total of B1s, B2s, and more, to things like the enormous walkers in the form of the OG-9 and Octuptarra. The LM-432 would fit in as a highly specialized unit with an average height of 1.49 meters, or 4 feet 11 inches, about a foot shorter than the B1, and 2 feet taller than an astromech, while having a width of 6 meters or 19 feet 8 inches, making it about 1.5 times the width of the Eta II. You'll see why I got the nickname the Muckraker, and it would be one of the last additions to the droid army, though why it was added may be more for profit than for tactical considerations. As this quote from the Techno-Union's LM-432 Risk Assessment Report reads, "Crab droids have subpar targeting percentage, but deliver a profit of 48,000 credits per unit. They might not win the war, but they could save the Techno-Union's fiscal quarter." So the evil Gumby folks might be one of the most realistic things in all of Star Wars. But to be fair, it was inspired by the flaws of the Spider droid, which was produced by Bactoid. But the Spider had many environmental failures related to navigating swampy and Arctic conditions, having issues in everything from their scanners to their motivators, and many different members of the CIS would contribute parts to bring the Crab droid to life, with techs being able to see the fingerprints of companies from the Trade Federation to the Hyper Communications Cartel, but with it being completed and shipped out by the Techno-Union. One of the most interesting features, though there are sadly no images of it, is that there are 8 different sizes of the Crab droid. Somewhat like the Spider Assassin probes, there was a tiny crab intended for espionage that could scurry about relatively undetected, all the way up to enormous ones that were larger than an AT-TE that could batter down enemy defenses from walls to siege doors, to others that had Gungan-made bubble warp projectors, which when fired rendered even Jedi completely immobile, and could be used to block exits, lock down cities, and jam up vehicles. But these that we see most are the mid-size heavy infantry series, which were covered in thick armor, rated to stop endless barrages of small arms fire. The very first time they were deployed was during the Second Battle of Jabim.
This next one goes out to the mutt jumpers of the 224th, slugging it out on Mimbum. Keep your heads down and your seals tight, boys.
And they would show off the Separatist ability to create a large array of customized gear and weapons. Many of the versions fielded on the mud-covered world came equipped with insulated vacuum pump systems, placed inside of their forward pincers, which were complex assemblies of tubing and spray nozzles that could suck up mud and spray it out, flipping the environmental conditions on their head, clearing a path for themselves and other CIS units, while making it rain mud on the Republic forces. creating the once thought impossible situation where a trooper was suddenly covered in even more mud. Hell for the organic clones, but also for the machinery and technology, everything from the optic systems of walkers and tanks to comms and repulsors. Tales of this horror is what gave it the name Muckraker, but in the end it ended up being applied to all 8 versions of the crab. What all these 8 had in common was the same design of 6 heavily armored limbs with powerful motivators to allow it to punch through the thickest rock and scale any terrain, even hanging upside down like the chameleon droids. Duranium teeth were on the tips of the limbs, along with the prongs to grip on each of the elbow joints. These 3 points could pinch together and sort of dig in and hang off of things, so it made it a truly all-terrain unit. These 3 eyes, or dots on its face, are the sensor bulb, targeting rangefinder, and backup photoreceptor, while these antennae allow it to be in constant contact with other droid units and commanders, be they T-Series or organic allies. This is one of those units that is more impressive for its ability to scale and alter the environment, playing more of a support role, but they did have a pair of blaster cannons slung beneath its central body. Though most clones did confirm that internal report, noticing that these crabs couldn't hit the broadside of a Venator. This made them little more than paperweights in the eyes of Republic troopers, and being stripped of their intended creepy or intimidating battlefield appearance, some brave clones would simply rush them and exploit a weakness shared throughout the GAR, which said that these crabs had a weak point just behind the head. Oh, they had to be careful as the crabs were quick on their feet and were known to run down and simply stomp troopers to death, being far quicker than clones could run on foot in full armor. After Jabeam, they would be seen during the Rhodia occupation. Rhodian Senator Anaconda Farr was compelled to enter into agreement with Trade Federation Viceroy Newt Gunray, who of course was secretly aligned with the Separatists. Under the pretense of providing protection, Separatist forces, including crab droids, briefly took control of the senatorial residence on Rhodia. During this occupation, Representative Jar Jar Binks, Senator Padme Amidala, and her protocol droid C-3PO were sent to Rhodia to discuss the Republic's assistance. Amidala was captured by Gunray's droids shortly after arrival. Meanwhile in the hangar, Binks and C-3PO encountered battle droids and a crab droid that charged at Binks, firing its blaster cannon. Binks took cover as C-3PO directed him from above. The crab droid accidentally flung Binks onto its back while trying to shake him off, leading to its loss of balance and it falling into the swamp below. The Gungan managed to cling to the edge, avoiding being pulled down with the droid. During the Battle of Malastare, many of the LM-432s could be seen marching along with traditional B-1s, B-2s, and Dwarf spider droids. But this visually impressive force was ultimately annihilated by the Republic's experimental electro-proton bomb. Because of the incredibly rough terrain at this citadel, many of them could be seen on Lola Seiyu, a Republic infiltration team consisting of Kenobi, Skywalker, Ahsoka Tano, and Cody was sent to rescue Even Peel and Wilf Tarkin, encountering many of these crab droids during their escape. Kenobi's team was ambushed by them on the airfield, with the crab dropping down to block their retreat, while simultaneously Skywalker's team traversed a fuel line to reach their rendezvous point, facing more security forces and crab droids upon exiting. Skywalker's quick thinking to throw a thermal detonator into a pipe destroyed a crab droid and allowed them to advance. The two reunited on the airfield, only to be met with even more crabs, where Fives would cover Echo as he destroyed one with a well-placed charge. After escaping the prison complex, they saw just how adept these droids were at climbing along a wall. Cody would have to jump onto one and deactivate it by pumping it full of plasma, and trapped by a cliff overlooking a river of lava, they grappled down to another ledge while R2-D2's reprogrammed battle droids delayed their pursuers, though they were quickly overcome. Later, more crab units would ambush the group at the cliff's edge, killing a clone officer and nearly another. Peel severed 3 of a crab droid's legs and destroyed its photoreceptor, while Tano and Peel stayed behind to combat more droids, Tano deflecting blaster shots and Teal bisecting another. The remaining 2 crab droids were finished off by the Jedi. Eventually, this group was extracted by gunship, successfully escaping despite another onslaught from more than 24 crab droids swarming the landing site. As the Clone Wars drew to a close, the last time we see them is during the Battle of Utapau, against the Republic's 212th Attack Battalion and Pau'an warriors. During the battle, we see one of the bravest soldiers in the entire GAR jumping onto a crab droid's back and initiating a rapid decommission. And after the Republic became the Empire, tens of thousands of crab droids were seized from the Techno-Union's factory on Tar Morden. The ultimate fate of this strange and fascinating unit would see them end up being used in live-fire stormtrooper training exercises on Karaida, which, if you like making fun of the stormtrooper accuracy, it's pretty hilarious that a droid that was known for its subpar targeting percentage would be used as target practice for stormtroopers. though it may have a far more grand ending if you consider that the Corridon engineers drew upon their experience with the crab droids in developing the MT-AT Spider Walker, the mountain terrain armored transport that's truly one of the strangest and most fear-inducing units ever produced by the Empire. So that's it for its history, and as for behind-the-scenes facts, the only thing we have is that the design of the crab droid stems from the transformed tank droid concepts dating back to the summer of 2002 by Ryan Church, who was one of the main prequel concept artists. The final shape was mostly there in a sketch called The Droid Soldiers. If you want to read more on it, a lot of these details came from Ultimate Star Wars, the Visual Encyclopedia, and mostly the Essential Guide to Droids. Please hit that like button, it's the best way to help me out. Subscribe to see more, and check out our other videos, I'm sure you'll like them. But most important of all, remember, no matter the species, war is a racket, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is all about the missile spamming monster that is the IG-227 Hailfire class droid tank. Like the OG-9 homing spider droid, the Hailfire was used to collect debts years before the Clone Wars broke out. Many financial commentators have pointed out that there are some startling similarities between the Hutt cartels and the intergalactic banking clan. While some lenders might go through the planetary or republic court systems, the Hutts and the Munes are willing to make much riskier loans. Added risk comes along with higher rates, but desperate criminals and spacers are willing to take these loans, knowing the exceptionally high returns on piracy and spice running could more than make up for it. The only problem is these people aren't exactly going to dress up for a day in court. Their dressing up will be in body armor and bandoliers, shooting at any debt collectors that come by. Hutts would resort to bounty hunters and assassins, but the Munes use loopholes to legally deploy these hoop-drive tanks, as the IBC sent droids with rockets to collect from delinquent borrowers. Because the bank would often loan to prospecting settlers of remote worlds, there were times when Hailfires were used to repossess entire planets. Whether outright destroying a city, or just scaring off the borrowers and acting as a sentry, the IG-227 had a great rate of return. Millions of credits and loans could be retrieved with a small 60,000 credit investment, the same price as a TIE fighter, and less than the OG-9. But unlike the spider duo that were made by Bactoid, the Hailfire was produced by the techno-religious Zychar bugs of Howard Engineering. They were able to keep the cost down by using a simple but effective mag pulse system on each of the hoops. Called a hoop drive, it would alternate between positive and negative charge differentials in the mag pulse unit, causing the wheel to spin towards the rear or forward so that it could accelerate or reverse. This gave it near instant acceleration, and the treads on these things allowed it to overcome almost any terrain. Much like the OG-9, it did not have a complicated AI. It isn't like the HMP that can just be told to hunt and eliminate an enemy. Behind this red photoreceptor eye, there are an array of sensors that receive direct input from the commander. You tell it where to go, then its processors are able to avoid obstacles and engage previously identified enemies. Sometimes this created a flaw where it wouldn't prioritize targets, opening up on troops before vehicles. But if this ever happened, the commander had an easy way to override it, telling it to eliminate ATTEs first, for example. And a single Hailfire can wreck the battlefield with its 30 missile payload, 15 in each box. It also had small twin-mounted blasters for dealing with some lightly armored troops, but this was the only thing it had to protect itself while it made its way back to the hangar or to the base in order to resupply. Later in the war, Howard developed a resupply drone that could fly out to meet the Hailfire and get it set up to roll with a fresh 30. With this supply line, they were able to make it appear like the Hailfire never ran out of ammunition. Paired up with the OG-9, the Spiders would prioritize troops, and the Hailfire would rain down rockets on vehicles. By firing a cluster of 3 or 4 rockets at a time, they were able to pick LAATs out of the sky, though of course these gunships were the bane of its existence. Other things like the height were deliberately chosen so that they could fire over CIS assets, just like the homing spider. Other cool features are that you could use these wheels to run over ranks of clone troopers, and that these weapon attachments were modular, meaning that it could be swapped out for heavy artillery, ion cannons, and anti-personnel stun weapons. I assumed that they would use these stun weapons when they weren't that angry with debtors, and later when they didn't want terrible PR when taking over worlds for the CIS. It would also work great as a clone catcher. During its debut in the Battle of Geonosis, 4,100 of these Hailfires were present. In this first battle, they proved to be such a powerful enemy that the Grand Army of the Republic developed Bantha Squad as an anti-Hailfire Special Forces unit. The Hailfire could be seen in conflicts all across the galaxy, and even fighting against the Republic's first generation of AT-AT. Many had a similar fate to the AT-TE. Even after the droid decommission at the end of the Clone Wars, some were out there still slinging rockets. During the subjugation of Kashyyyk, the Wookiees used repurposed Hailfires to fight off the Empire. This must have been an insanely abrupt shift in thinking, as the droids became their only way to fight off the clone troopers, who had just been their allies a few weeks before. And this is actually one of the CIS droids that was able to be salvaged by the Alliance to restore the Republic, deploying them against the Empire on various worlds from 1 ABY on. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The stat for the top speed is only 45 km per hour or 28 miles per hour, but that just doesn't make sense to me. That means you'd be honked at for being too slow in a residential neighborhood, and that really doesn't match what we see on screen. There were tons of visual ways that Lucas wanted to signify that the CIS were the bad guys, and even the color of smoke was used to help the viewer realize this, as the LAAT's rockets would leave these clean white smoke trails, whereas the Hailfire's rockets were all erratic and raspy, leaving smoggy black trails. And this vehicle was inspired by a mix of two Russian vehicles, the big-wheeled Russian Tsar tank, and the rocket packs on the Katruska. But it also draws on things like a 16th century Korean rocket launcher system called the Hwakcha. Additional information was gained by the Canon Guide's Star Wars Encyclopedia of Starships and Other Vehicles, Legends Guide, the New Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, the New Essential Chronology, the Essential Guide to Warfare, and Ultimate Star Wars, while also appearing in the game Star Wars Commander. But most important of all, remember, just pay your debts, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is all about the Variable Geometry Self-Propelled Battle Droid, Mark I, often referred to as the Vulture Droid, and surprisingly never called the VGS-PD-BD Mk1. The main droid fighter of the Confederacy of Independent Systems was manufactured by one of the most obscure species in Star Wars, the fanatical insects called the Zychar, whose society revolved around a religious cult of starship production. The four-legged bugs felt that the best way to experience the divine was to craft vessels made for traveling the stars, and they actually produced tons of ships and droids used by the CIS, including the Sheathipede, C-9979, and the Hailfire tank, just to name a few. Because of the aforementioned variable geometry, the length and height of this ship will change relative to whether it's walking or flying, so I'll just do this comparison in flight mode. Its length of 6.96 meters, or 23 feet, is about half the length of the X-Wing, and about a baby Jawa shorter than the TIE Fighter, while its height of 1.86 meters made it shorter than a Wookiee, and about half the height of the ARC-170. At a width of 4.75 meters, or 16 feet, it was thinner than the TIE Fighter, and around 1/4 the Y-Wing. Using our standard unit of the Imperial 1 class Star Destroyer, you could line up 230 Vulture droids from bow to thruster, and they would actually be smaller than some of the ISD's heavy turbo laser batteries. And for some comparisons to our world, it was about 1.5 Honda Civics long, with a similar height, and about 2 Civics across. Now what is really impressive is that you got a ship with an incredibly small profile, but that had an impressive top atmospheric speed of 1,200 kilometers per hour, or 746 miles per hour, making it tied with the TIE Fighter, and faster than the ARC-170 and the X-Wing, but it also packed an impressive armament. There are 2 different versions, with some having 4 laser cannons, a pair on each wing, while these openings here could be used for proton torpedoes, but others had systems in which the laser cannon or torpedoes could rotate into place when needed. And what's more, this fast, strong, small fighter only cost 19,000 credits, 1/3 the cost of a TIE, and 1/7 the cost of the X-Wing and ARC-170. By taking a look inside of this droid, we can see how this section above the laser cannons contains a series of power cells and converters, but if we move down, we can see a small repulsor lift array that helped to both reduce the effects of a hard landing and push this craft up when it went from walking mode into flight. We can see the pneumatic system that also aided in this transition, along with these scissor action tips that would extend when walking and help it navigate uneven terrain. It is easy to focus on how these nimble fighters were able to rip apart Republic ships, but often overlooked is how these leg features and its walking mode allowed the CIS to use this as a sort of tank or sentry in places where civilians might need some reconditioning. Though the wing-mounted laser cannons would be rendered useless, The body was angled so that no matter the variant, you could fire either your laser cannons or proton torpedoes into groups of people supporting the Republic. Creating this type of ship shows a military philosophy held by the CIS, which thought to use overwhelming numbers and have units that were capable of things that organics could not accomplish, like some of the features of battle droids, but also a maneuverability that can only be achieved with droid fighters. Vultures, Hyenas, and Tri-Droids were all able to handle G-forces that would cause organics to pass out, while also having quicker reaction times. Taking a look into this main body, we can see the head is full of sensors that allow this droid to see in ways a human could not, picking up magnetic signatures and infrared, and passing it straight into its droid brain, instead of something like an ARC-170, which might also be able to collect this data through sensors, but could only relay this information to its organic pilot. In order to take advantage of these droid features, we can see that it used electromagnetic vectoring in order to direct the flow of ions coming from its engine. To generate all this power, the Vulture had solid fuel slugs, something we see in other CIS ships, instead of the more commonly used Tabana gas. Using this solid fuel, they were able to get greater energy output in a shorter time, while also taking up less space. Excellent Zychar design allowed these slugs to be replaced incredibly fast, something necessary since the Vulture droid only had a flight time of 35 minutes. As for its history, the Trade Federation were the first to purchase the Vulture droid, loving the fact that these droids could escort shipments through hyperspace by simply attaching themselves to the hull of otherwise defenseless transports. When it came to the Lucrehulk, the standard complement would be 1,500 Vulture droids, which could just attach themselves to the exterior, something the battlecruiser's designers planned for, putting in energy grids that could charge the Vultures without them having to take up space in the hangar bay. Originally, these were all governed by those Lucrehulks, also referred to as the droid control ships, having a similar relationship to the B-1 battle droids, but the loss at Naboo would come to be a valuable lesson for the CIS, which would work in droid brains that allowed these to operate independently. But interestingly, they also had the ability to communicate with each other, which would often sound like an electronic chattering. Vulture droids would remain a staple of the CIS war effort, seen at nearly every major engagement, with many CIS tacticians realizing that it was sometimes better to have the Vultures just smash into the enemy's capital ships, instead of coming back to refuel. Their legacy would actually outlive the CIS, as many were picked up by rebel cells, and used against the Empire, most notably with the Free Ryloth movement, and Birch Teller's rebel cell. Cham Syndulla's group was able to use them in his assassination plot against Vader and Palpatine, which though unsuccessful, did result in the destruction of the Star Destroyer Perilous. Thrawn would face them after they were given to Birch Teller's rebels by Vice Admiral Dodd Rancet, who was attempting to eliminate his rival, Moff Williff Tarkin. But the very last time we see them is around 60 years after their introduction to the galaxy, when Vultures were being used as security droids by the wealthy houses on Cato Neimoidia. So that's it for their history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. Originally, these were to be piloted by B-1s, and you can actually do this in the original Battlefront video games, though this was really just because it was necessary for the game's mechanics. This is one of the few ships to have its dimensions changed in canon, doubling it in size, but I think I agree more with canon on this one, as the Legends would have the Vulture droid around the length and height of a Fiat 500, and only about 1.5 Wookiees across. And many have compared this to the Japanese Type 0, a fast, maneuverable plane that was mass-produced, and which were sometimes crashed into enemy capital ships. So that's it for the Vulture droid. If you want to connect with us, help support this channel, or get your own copies of the reference material used in this video, be sure to check out the description down below. But most important of all, remember, if you ever feel divinely inspired by a Star Wars ship, you might be a Zychar, and the Force will be with you, always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is all about the Vulture droid's explosives dropping brother, the Hyena bomber. If you know your galactic politics and Outer Rim tax history, you know that many corporations were able to have military-grade weapons in order to defend themselves from pirates. This allowed for things like Vulture droids and homing spiders, but it seems that bombers were a bit too excessive. Like most bans on certain types of self-defense weapons, it gets a bit slippery with the logic. Snail tanks that can fire concussion missiles are okay, but bombers are a bit too much. I think it has to do with bombs being less accurate and way more powerful, so the Trade Federation asking for exemptions to build bombers is kinda like somebody saying they need a grenade launcher for self-defense as opposed to a rifle. So it wasn't until the Clone Wars actually broke out that Bactoid Armor Workshop started to mass produce Hyena bombers. At a cost of only 23,000 credits, it was only $3,000 more than its Vulture predecessor, and around 6 times cheaper than the bombers used by the Republic, like the Y-Wing. This is one of the best examples of how much more efficient the Geonosian builders were, as it packs in so much more than the Republic manufacturers. Just start with its armament, which includes 4 light laser cannons and a diverse payload of 6 proton torpedoes, 6 concussion missiles, and 4 proton bombs. It's carrying all of that at once, and I know it's not fair to directly compare it to the Y-Wing, a ship that was also meant to function as a long-range, hyperdrive-equipped heavy starfighter, but my point is that the Hyena is an expression of CIS military philosophy. A squad of 2 Y-Wings, 2 ARC-170s, and 4 V-Wings would cost the Republic about 1 million credits. That could buy you 44 Hyena bombers, or if you wanted to keep it equally diverse with the CIS versions of the Interceptor, Fighter, and Bomber, you could have 12 Hyena, 12 Vultures, and 25 Tri-Droids. Of course, they have to contend with the Republic shields and rear gunners, but such a great number of ships that could be purchased made it so that even though none of those CIS ships have hyperdrives, there could be so many of them stationed across the galaxy that their sheer numbers could deal with any Republic threat that popped into real space. And this is made even more practical by the fact that, like Vulture droids, they can attach to the ship's exterior, or could be neatly lined up inside of ship hangars. Though of course they were larger than the Vulture. At a length of 12.5 meters or 41 feet, it was nearly twice the length of the Vulture droid, and the exact same size as the X-Wing. But it wasn't much taller, just an Ewok more than its predecessor, with a height of 3.1 meters or 10 feet. Despite this greater overall size and substantial payload, it was still relatively fast. Just 30 kilometers per hour less than the Vulture, with a top atmospheric speed of 1,150 kilometers per hour or 715 miles per hour, making it faster than the Y-Wing and TIE Bomber. So despite their size, they are still quick and agile, seen here being able to dodge turbolasers and weave in between the bridges of the Venator. Moments like this show us just how powerful the Hyena is, with its proton bombs being able to blow through the Venator's hull. And other times we see that even when shot down, the resulting explosion upon impact is strong enough for these Hyenas to take out the sturdy legs of an ATTE. But it also has a great AI system. While the precise bombing coordinates would often be directly entered by CIS personnel, if it needed to, it could determine on its own the best target to drop its payload on, and which enemy starfighters it needed to engage with its laser cannons. This level of autonomy is something seen in most CIS fighters, but greater than most droid vehicles. As for loading this thing up, it appears to be done manually by B-1 battle droids. Each of the head units acts as an ordnance pod, with the top section of the main head containing the droid brain and iconic red photoreceptors. I'd assume that this loading could have also been done by some other purpose-made loading machine, but you can see that when resupplying, it can split the wing. Breaking about midway and then separating into a wider four-legged stance, it becomes sturdier and low enough for the B-1 to insert the proton bombs. When they weren't being loaded, they could stand straight up just like a Vulture droid, saving you some hangar space by not being so wide. Vultures can hang like bats from the ceilings of things like the Lucrehulk, so although we never see this, I do wonder if the Hyena could do this too. When it was time for them to deploy, a droid would activate them upon the orders of a CIS commander. Using audible electronic chattering noises to communicate with each other is where you get the name Hyena. Droids speaking to each other via vocoders is actually pretty common with the CIS, having tactical droids speaking orders to HMP droid gunships, with it replying back audibly.
The army will follow. Leave no survivors. Now, by your command.
And so we see that starfighters are speaking to each other as well. We even see that a T-Series can speak directly to a Hyena while it's in combat in order to modify its previous orders.
Calculate your flight path to terminate in the main hangar.
This, combined with an ability of the head unit to lift and move independently from the body, allowed it to survey its surroundings and then chatter the location of new routes and enemies to its squad mates. The first time the bomber was used against the Republic was during the Battle of Phaelin. Here they destroyed all of the Republic's unsuspecting forces. That same year they nearly crashed into the Republic's cloak ship, on their way to trying to bomb out Senator Organa on Christophsis. Later, during the Battle of Ryloth, we saw how devastating they can be against a large village. Just a handful of them were able to set this Twi'lek village up in flames in just a matter of seconds. Shortly after that, we got to see the Hyenas nearly kill Mace Windu, but also see just how gangster Wat Tambor was.
We will all perish for the glory of the Separatist Alliance.
And then some were allowed to be commanded by the droid assassin Helios 3D. This IG series droid had his capital ship boarded by Anakin and Obi-Wan, forcing him to transfer his consciousness into a B1 in order to escape. And speaking of droid consciousness, I wanted to know your guys' opinion on the sense of self that a Hyena might possess. We see that a crashed HMP was able to push through and make one last shot, and we see something similar with a Hyena during the space battle of Sullust. After given the order to take out Ventress, a damaged Hyena bomber tries to fight through its malfunctions and suicide bomb her position. We mentioned earlier that starfighter droids have a somewhat robust AI, so do you think that this is evidence that there is an I in there that wants to complete this mission, or is it just following orders? After Ventress survived, the fight continues on Dathomir, where we see the Hyenas being used first to soften up the witch's defenses before land units are sent in. And the final time we see them is on Scipio. A surprise attack destroyed C-70s and LA-ATs with ease, and then they later engaged the Republic's response team that came to rescue Padme. This engagement on Scipio shows the best and worst parts of the Hyena, with its payload being devastating, but its lack of shields making it easy to pick off with the Z-95 headhunters and other Republic ships. Once Vader cut down the CIS leadership, it is believed that all of the Hyena droids died with the Separatist movement. But we know that Vulture droids were used in great numbers by anti-Imperial forces, most notably on Umbara. So I suspect that some Hyenas are out there somewhere in the galaxy, laughing about the fall of the Republic. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. I'll just start by addressing the animal in the room. No, I'm not aware of any hyenas in the Star Wars universe. We just gotta shut off that part of our brain when it comes to those kind of lore questions. I think it's cool that on Ryloth we see that the ATTE has targeting identification graphical displays, which tell the clones that it is a hyena that is approaching. And it first appeared in the webcomic The Clone Wars: The Fall of Faeline. And in Legends, it was first named the Hyena Bomber in the Clone Wars campaign guide, and in canon via Ultimate Star Wars. And the names Vulture and Hyena are representative of the Republic's state of decay. Vultures and hyenas are known for picking from the carcasses of animals killed by something else, symbolic of how Palpatine was actually the one killing the Republic. As for the stats and all that, additional information comes from the books On the Frontlines and the Encyclopedia of Star Wars and Other Vehicles. But most important of all, remember, pour out a Java Juice for OG Watt, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerds? This video is all about the CIS rival to the LA-AT, the Heavy Missile Platform Droid Gunship. We all know that the LA-AT gunship was a Republic workhorse present at the very opening of the Clone Wars, but this droid gunship doesn't appear until 2 years later, presented during the Civil War on Onderon. It was produced in conjunction with Bactoid Armor Workshop and Howard Charles Engineering, making this thing a product of some of the strangest and creepiest bugs in the galaxy. Let's look at some of its raw stats before we get into its history and take a look at its cross-section. This may just be Separatist propaganda, but it's been reported that the HMP only costs 60,000 credits. This would make it the same cost as a TIE fighter and less than half an ARC-170. I doubt this number because of just how much is packed into it. Its payload was a whopping 14 missile tubes, 7 on each side, but these could be swapped out for various munitions like concussion missiles, torpedoes, and Discord missiles, just to name a few. Then you have its 2 light laser cannons on the wing, and 2 dual medium laser cannon turrets, as well as this central medium laser cannon. That's 7 laser cannons, with 5 of them being medium laser cannons. That's more firepower than almost any starfighter. But to be fair, that's true of the LA-AT gunship too. But if that wasn't enough, those light laser cannons on the wings were modular, meaning they could act like hardpoints to accommodate other weaponry. These included everything from long-range laser cannons that allowed it to act like a hovering sniper droid, radiation emitters to damage organics through shields, EMP bombs for taking out electronics, incendiaries for thick vegetation, or concussion bombs with yields more than 600 times your standard rocket. All that, and we still haven't talked about its role as a troop transport. These racks on the ventral side allowed it to carry 12 B1s or B2s, and perhaps 4 super battle rocket droids. I'm not aware if it's ever been shown, but I can't imagine why there couldn't be modified racks to accommodate droidicas, or even aqua droids and LR-57s. With all these weapons and droids packed onto it, you think it might be slow, and well, it kinda is when you compare it to other starfighters, but its 600 km per hour or 373 mile per hour top atmospheric speed is only 20 km per hour less than the LA-AT. This is due to a newly tested type of super dense radioactive fuel, which packed an incredible amount of power into a relatively small fuel tank. Its overall length was 12.46 meters or 41 feet, making it about 2 Wookiees shorter than the LA-AT and a baby Jawa shorter than the X-Wing. At 11 meters or 36 feet wide, it was 3 Wookiees thinner than the LA-AT, or about half the width of the ARC-170. Its height was 3.1 meters or 10 feet, making it about half the height of the Republic gunship, or 1/3 that of an AT-ST. Let's go ahead and see how it was actually used during the Clone Wars. In the year 20 BBY, the new king of Onderon, Sanjar Rosh, wanted his planet to join the CIS. But many citizens were willing to fight this, laying down their lives for the independence that kept them out of the devastation of the Clone Wars. To fight this growing rebellion, Tactical Droid Kalani informs the Puppet King that the CIS will be using this theater to debut their new gunship. This is a good time to remember that almost all of the CIS starfighters and vehicles are actually droids with their own AI. Some droids are programmed to serve Jawa Juice, some are programmed to serve concussion missiles. General Kalani just talks to these gunships as if they were another droid unit, because they are. They aren't humanoid shaped, so it's easy to think of them as just vehicles, but you just talk to it like you would a B-1. They even respond with their own vocoders in a deep and intimidating voice. Now these Onderon rebels are some of the most fearless in the galaxy, so when presented with these mechanized terrors, they don't cower, they just try and take them down. The droid's battlefield intelligence is high, making sure that they knock out the big guns first, but the rebels still try their small arms. Blaster bolts are harmlessly absorbed, and even when Saw Gerrera perfectly lands a thermal detonator, the HMP's shields just shrug it off. Though they continue fighting, panic starts to creep into the back of their minds, and just listen to how Ahsoka pleads with Anakin and Obi-Wan to send help.
It's a full-scale war! They need our help! Please talk to the Council!
Anakin hates sitting back, but knows that Obi-Wan is right. They can't just throw Republic assets at a problem that they were never supposed to be involved in the first place. The real question is, where else could one get the kind of firepower necessary to take down a ray-shielded gunship? Or as Obi-Wan words it,
who in the galaxy would be running around with an extra batch of missiles?
Hondo.
Anakin is tasked with getting these missiles delivered to Onderon, and his frenemy Hondo Ohnaka takes great pleasure at seeing a Jedi getting involved in the illegal arms trade.
Now why would a Jedi need to deliver arms illegally?
Paid very well, the Weequay pirate delivers 6 of these state-of-the-art shoulder-fired rocket launchers. An ambush by commando droids nearly intercepts the rockets, but they are repelled, and the weapons are rushed to the battlefront. Without an explanation of where they came from or even how to use it, an eager Saw grabs one and lines up a gunship in his sights. A single rocket is fired, hitting the side of the wing, but packs enough punch to break through the ray shielding and send it spiraling down into a fiery grave. Watch again how the purple bubble of its shielding flickers in shock. These powerful new weapons are split up amongst the rebels, right as they get word that the gunships had moved on the True King's position. Its laser cannons rip through fleshy organics, but as Steela approached, we see another of its features on display. When she fires a rocket, the droid's sensors alert it and direct its repulsors to dart out of the way. Whipping around, it locks onto her flying mount known as a Rupping, but cleverly she jumps off. As the gunship tracks it, she uses this diversion to lock onto the droid again and fire away. This shot hits it right in its own missile payload, instantly overriding its shields and sending a chain reaction that ignites some fuel. Wedged right in between the payload and the fuel is the repulsor lift, the thing keeping the droid up in the air. Without even knowing it, Steela hits this new gunship in one of its most vulnerable areas. That's 2 gunships down, but the real problem is that the king is being pursued by commando droids. Some expert shooting by Steela helps to end this threat, but 2 more gunships come racing towards them. These had a fresh payload, which makes for a much larger explosion when these ones get hit. We get a great view of this with Saw's shot, seeing how individual missile pods are going off. This wrecked the repulsor systems, which combined with it going forward at full speed, sent it recklessly spinning forward. I won't go too crazy with the speculating here, but it's possible that it crashing into the king's location was no accident. We already talked about how they have a complex AI system and features that do tend to produce a sense of sentience, like being able to receive and share their ideas via its sensors and vocoder. We see this time and time again in the Star Wars universe, that the more advanced the droid, the more sentient behaviors it tends to display. This final gunship seems like it is putting everything it had into eliminating its target, trying to steer itself with the last of its energy into its enemy. This dedication to its mission is profound, as even in a mangled heap, it pushes through and finds a way to move its medium laser cannon. When it opens fire, Lux shows some amazing reaction time and accuracy, but also Ahsoka just got blasted by a medium laser cannon at pretty close range. That's a gun way more powerful than your strongest sniper rifles, and like we said earlier, something that you don't even see in many starfighters. You have to get up into ARC-170 territory to see those kinds of cannons. Let me know how you think she took this shot so well, and if you think that the droid is showing a drive above and beyond just raw coding. That last push by the HMP cost Steela her life, and would consume Saw Gerrera with regret and hatred, spending the rest of his life fighting a war without any rules. After this battle, we can see how they were used in space combat during the raid on General Kenobi's Venator. The Negotiator was boarded by a team of Vulture droids, Grievous's Sheathipede, and gunships with squads of B-1s and B-2s. Then during Tup's transport to Kamino from Ringo Vinda, they are ambushed by an HMP with 4 super battle droid rocket troopers. You can see that these larger droids are carried on these larger racks, while the missile pods are now packing the much larger Discord missiles. Each Discord missile delivers a cloud of terrifying buzz droids. What's interesting about this attack though, is that you would assume that the Republic cleared this sector after fighting in the orbital ring, so where did this ship come from? It is space, so it could be hard to detect the ship anyways, but I think we should keep the idea open that although these do not have hyperdrives listed officially, there may be some special units outfitted with their own hyperdrives. Or perhaps they emerged out of some sort of cloaked CIS capital ship. We next see them being used on Scipio, where they were instrumental in the CIS invasion of this Mun world. As Coruscant Guard shock troopers attempted to protect Padme, Hyena bombers made quick work of the LA-ATs and C-70s, while the HMPs swooped in for the troopers. Its laser cannons cut down a squad's worth in seconds, while their battle droid delivery finished off the rest, including the heroic Z6 wielding trooper known as Thorn. That same year, in the final moments of the Clone Wars in 19 BBY, HMPs provided aerial support to the Snail tanks and Dwarf spider droids as they attempted to take the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk. Here, a daring gunship nearly changed the course of galactic history with a single shot that barely missed the little green Jedi Master. After the Clone Wars, there wasn't too much to be heard about this droid. I think it's safe to say that Palpatine prioritized the decommission of these deadly gunships, and the only time we see them fighting against the Empire is in the use of Geonosian CIS holdout Geyser Delso.
A Geonosian separatist who'd somehow escaped Lord Vader's efforts to wipe out the remnants of the CIS.
He was actually able to use some to board an Imperial-class Star Destroyer.
Sir, the droids have landed on our ship. We can't launch our fighters.
Calm down, pilot. Get out there and destroy that transport.
But I like to think that somewhere out there in the vast galaxy, some rebels or pirates came across one of these Clone Wars droid veterans. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. This logo with 3 9s or 6s making a circle is from King Addo Emon from Karam 5, a mid-rim planet that dedicated their massive manufacturing plants to help the CIS pump out droid gunships. The HMP was inspired by early concept art for the LA-AT, and in the script for the Clone Wars TV show, it was referred to as the HMP Predator. I don't know about you, but I think that's a pretty fitting name for it. For gameplay purposes, the HMP is piloted by a droid unit so that a player can operate it. Cross-sections come from the Revenge of the Sith Incredible Cross-Sections book, with additional information coming from Ultimate Star Wars, Vehicles and Vessels books, and the Star Wars Complete Encyclopedia and Guide to Warfare. When it says in its deep robotic voice, "By your command," that's a reference to Cylons from the Battlestar Galactica universe.
By your command.
And the whole Onderon arc was inspired by the US and Soviets' interactions in Afghanistan. One major factor for the Soviets withdrawing from Afghanistan was the fact that the rebels had been provided Stinger missiles. Soviet air superiority was one of the hardest things to counter, but once the CIA secretly supplied the rebels with these advanced weapons, the rebels finally had a chance. It's said that Mujahideen using these stingers were able to get a 79% kill ratio, taking down approximately 269 aircraft. Influential Russian writer Alexander Prokhanov said that the stinger was a turning point, and Tipping Point is the name of the episode in which the rebels get these weapons. So that's it for the HMP droid gunship. But most important of all, remember, always ask the important questions, like what about the droid gunship attack on the Onderonians? And the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, MetaNerdz? This video is all about the Tri-Droid fighter, one of the main starfighters of the CIS. It was manufactured by Kala Designs and Flak Offok Automata Industries, the same people who helped to make the Droideka and provided the fuel for the HMP droid gunship. At a cost of 30,000 credits, it was 1.5 times the cost of the Vulture droid and half the price of the TIE fighter. At a length of 5.4 meters, or 18 feet, it was less than half the length of the X-Wing and shorter than a Vulture droid. At a width of 3.45 meters, or 11 feet, it was about half as wide as a TIE fighter and not even 2 Wookiees across. And with a similar height around 3.45 meters, it was less than half as tall as a TIE fighter and about twice the height of the Vulture droid. As for our standard unit of the Imperial 1 class Star Destroyer, you could line up 296 Tri-Droids from bow to stern. And for some real-world comparisons, it was about as long as a Honda Odyssey and about twice as tall, while the F-16 is about 3 times as long and wide while being just a bit taller. With a top atmospheric speed of 1,050 km per hour, or 652 miles per hour, it was the exact same speed as the ARC-170 and the X-Wing, while being slower than the TIE fighter. And like the TIE, it didn't have any shields or hyperdrive. Its armament is one of the things that makes the Tri-Droid fighter so impressive, with its medium laser cannon, 3 light laser cannons, and a variable payload of 6 medium concussion missiles, or 6 buzz droid containing Discord missiles. Not driven by a droid pilot, it was similar to the Vulture and Hyena, in that it had an integrated droid brain that comes as close as possible to removing input lag, allowing the fighter to respond to threats as they were picked up by the sensors. By taking a look inside of the ship, we can see where the weapon systems were charged via this port, energizing the power packs that line this area. Fuel was stored in the backside of this arch, injected down into the ion acceleration chamber, and the ions were directed by this nozzle to increase its maneuverability. To power all the computer systems and weapons, this centrally located main reactor was encased in layers of durasteel. These photoreceptor eyes gave it a bug-like appearance, and its communication arrays were located here. The Tri-Droid's main systems were in this gyroscopic core, which kept it level while being incredibly maneuverable, and its higher level transceiver meant that it had a greater range than the Vulture droid. Some other interesting features are that the laser cannons on its wings allowed them to be slightly adjusted up and down independently, and the main cannon is manufactured by the same line in the DSD-1 Dwarf Spider. As for its history, the first time the Tri-Droid fighter was deployed was on the outer rim planet of Praesetlin in the year 20 BBY, when the CIS tried to capture the Intergalactic Communication Center, which would have allowed them to interfere with the HoloNet. They stunned the Republic by being able to blow apart the T-19 starfighters of the Planetary Defense Force, and even proved difficult for the ace Jedi pilots Saesee Tiin and Anakin Skywalker. Their biggest role would be during the Battle of Coruscant, tearing up ARC-170s and taking their fight down to the cities of Coruscant. The Tri-Droids were decommissioned after the execution of the Separatist Council, which led to many pirates and junkers trying to bring them back to life. So that's it for its history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. One of the original concepts for this ship was that it would be shot like a missile from CIS capital ships, attached to boosters that would jettison off, and they would continue with their momentum as a starfighter. This idea was thrown out, however, because it would be too confusing on screen with the already chaotic Battle of Coruscant. And the overall look of this ship is based on the skull of one of the most terrifying predators on the Colicoid's homeworld. But most important of all, remember, beware the droids bearing droids, and the Force will be with you. Always.